And I'd be very comfortable with him.
I'm sorry, she did take last, she dropped.
I don't think so.
I was gonna say I didn't see her last now the other day, but
Maybe you said about that line there. Yes, sir. So this is. I don't know if you
oh, it was a disaster.
You know what I'm saying? See this
Yeah,
guy right up here?
I
just throw that out, because when he came to see me today, I mentioned that as well. But I knew we were gonna discuss it. Well, but that's.
Not that Spanish is going any better, but
Hey,
at least I know for
never got a
sure
call,
that I
it's been a
turned in.
3-point game.
Get out.
Kids didn't come. Hi, how are ya? Oh, I'm good.
Saw your son in school today.
Oh, did you? Was he such a good boy?
He's always so polite. Always stops and says hello to me. I hope so. Don't you worry, I'm not like that.
That's right, you tell me.
You know me. Tell me. I think you're going to send us that class. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I know. Weren't they nice? That was a good group. They said they all through, kindergarten. Remember?
I know. Is he going again?
Yeah, when is it?
Saturday.
Oh, it's this Saturday? Oh, I'm telling you.
I know.
Oh, he's going with a girl? Oh, no, Ryan doesn't discuss girls.
Yes.
He says he's going with Pete Hill and Pete and Sandy Dave. Oh, we did? Is he all right? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, Ryan's there. Leland went up. Was the JV up there too, or were they? Oh, Sam does such a good job with his, elementary.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing.
So responsible. Hi. Good to see you too.
Short sleeves out a little early, didn't you?
Refrigerated and everything.
That to me is finally
Shot.
because when you're finally safe.
Yes.
It was good. Shut up.
She's amazing. She's just a really good, good girl. Yeah.
And we felt it was great with concrete. You know those trees.
Oh, I know. Yeah. I know, football's just a bit. Yeah. That's the ones who listen to wrestling, they didn't do that. Yeah.
And there's something with
The library.
No. Is that? And I don't know what him. Heard that.
Yeah, I said him all.
Yeah, he said to Ryan, that's right.
I just don't know what
Sheriff.
Oh, nice. You guys will do that? Oh, that's fine.
And he just went, oh, okay, like walked away, I said, you didn't tell me what to do. No, Mom. I didn't want to have that conversation with him. Okay. Now he's starting to run. Yeah.
It's always going to be helpful.
10 years of teaching.
Yeah. You're dreaming,
Yeah. Coach got a job.
Once you start, you don't stop, huh?
Brian's got so many football teams he needs to go to. So,
I saw.
Minneapolis, maybe we could go down to Georgia, and I'm like, their camp's only like $70 now. Yeah, but. It's nice.
What I gotta do?
Yeah, it's confirmation. It's just a market. It's just a market for us. Okay, great, you know, all right. So look, years old, looks okay.
Need another pen?
Nice for you.
No. It's interesting at the same place, 2 years.
Okay, you okay?
Ted, I had Mike in here.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Running a little late.
Head up at the Cracker News. It is.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? We have a number of packets, and I'd like to just review those quickly. This one here that has our agenda for today. On the second page will be the minutes from the last meeting. We'll get to that in a second. I'd also like to speak to the public that is here in attendance. If you would like an opportunity to address the group about the topics that we've talked about, we'd like to do that tonight. If you could kind of amongst yourselves select a person, be kind of a spokesperson, and maybe give that person some ideas as to what you'd like brought up. Again, we do not speak about personnel, specific personnel, or things of that nature, but most of you have been here every meeting, so you see what we're doing. And so if you'd like to address our committee, we'd like to offer that opportunity to a representative from your group at the end, okay? So then, third, we have two proposed recommendations to the Board of Education. We'll talk about that. Mr. Piotrowski has done an excellent job in putting together three components of the mission statement that would address specific outcomes for modified JV and varsity. We are going to create a proposed template for parent meetings. We'll review New Hartford Department of Communication, how Ms. Giovanni schedules with outside groups, what the protocol is for the building principals, relationships with sports programs. As I said, we'll conclude again with any comments from public here. If you could take a quick look at the minutes, please. Last meeting we reviewed attributes of a successful coach. We looked to see how our future is going to be different from the present, and there's some pretty good ideas there as to how we can move forward here. We never got to number 3 due to time constraints, and we can address that if we get time. Number 4, we obviously did not have a consensus here in regards to communicating with coach in regards to playing time, which I think is important as well, to see that we have a variety of ways to look at it. We also did not have consensus in regards to should parent meetings be required, and Mr. Alvanos can address that today as to what the actual procedure is for parent meetings. In your book, I think it's the very last section of the coach's handbook. There are excellent recommendations in regards to parents, and it begins on page 98. But there are terrific recommendations there, so I strongly urge you to read from 98 on. It's actually to the end of the booklet on ideas for parents. Then on page 3, we'll continue on with our, we have a draft that Mr. Piotrowski prepared. And then, if you look at page 4, different ideas in regards to communication, we'd like to review again our proposed recommendations so far. I said there are 2, but I added 2 more ideas that were brought up. And then we have the current tool used by the athletic administration in regards to evaluation of coaches. And then if you kindly go back to the first page again, a number of issues have been brought to my attention that we may want to discuss, and these are from members of our committee, to talk about the use of the weight room, intramurals, Booster Club's philosophy, and the whole philosophy of should we encourage our student athletes to play free sports versus specialization. So those in the back of our mind. I also would like to add, ladies and gentlemen, that in our original calendar, we said that we are going to make a recommendation to the Board of Education at our next meeting, which is toward the end of June. However, I think we might have a few more topics, so I wrote all of you little notes telling you that we will be probably meeting later on in the summer, if that's acceptable. And then I have some calendars here where we could look at some calendars to decide if what dates are good. So that recommendation that we are going to make in June to the Board of Education, we might be doing that later on in July. Okay? So that gives us an idea of where we're going. Let's take a look, please, if we could, at, we'll go start with Mr. Petrowski's draft, and we'll go right to the mission statement again, which we covered in the first day. And what we did is we asked if we could, one of the recommendations that we are considering is to suggest to the Board of Education that the mission statement have actually 3 specific components at the end of it to address specific outcomes for modified JV and varsity. So Paul, if I could ask you to go through the research that you've done, and we want to thank you for doing extra work for us. And if you can start our conversation by explaining to us what work you've done.
Okay. First of all, the draft that's attached in the handout of Mr. Hunting is not the right one. I put out one that looks like this with draft on top. I put a couple copies on the chair there. It should look like this. There's draft. I'm passing out to each member. I have another copy for who needs it. Anybody that need one? Anybody here? As I stated at the last meeting, I believe that the mission statement, which is the New York State Interscholastic Athletic Program mission statement, if it's good enough for all the school districts in New York State, it certainly is good enough for New Hartford, and I didn't want to touch upon that. I also read through all the goals of quality interscholastic athletic program, which are on page 2 in our handbook there. Well, Mission Statement, page 2. And I read about quality coaching, successful coaches possess traits, adults, and creators, stockholders, etc. After reading all that, I did not want to reinvent the wheel. So I addressed playing time as my priority, so that somewheres in here, I thought it would be spelled out. And again, the top word on this is in dark letters, it says draft. We're here to discuss it, it's not set in stone, it's my own thoughts, and of course it can be changed in any area. The Roman numeral number 1, modified, on the second page of my handout, I copied the New York State Public High School Athletic Association concerns, and on the back of it is section 3, philosophy of modified sports, and they are almost word for word identical. So I would say that the modified rules for New Hartford, so rules governing playing time are covered by the New York State Public High School Athletic Association, section 3, and then I have TVL in dark letters. And I put it in bold letters because I don't know which way the TVL is going. So if you want TVL, that's fine. If you want to put down and league rules, that's fine. I don't know how to put that down. It will be the same thing. Because we do have a couple different rules within the TVL that we adhere to when we play TVL schools. Okay?
Speaking from TVL perspective, I strongly feel TVL should be in there because one of the most important things that TVL does is endorses a full participation in the fifth quarter concept throughout the whole breadth of modified, and that is something all the member schools really, really believe in as a way to have a fifth quarter concept.
Yes. And again, it's going to vary from sport to sport. Right. Certain sports, and again, when Paul called me on this, if you go to the Section 3 website, it varies based on your roster number. So for example, like soccer, you have to have, I think it's 20, I believe it's 23 players on your roster. Now, if New Hartford has 23 and our opponent has 20, you're only playing 4 quarters. We have to have 23, they have to have 23. And where this is a catch-22 at times, the coaches might agree to play that fifth quarter, but it's a clear violation of the section rule. And it happened to us, to be honest, it happened to us in basketball. We had 11, the opponent had 12, we played the fifth quarter, we should have only played 4. And the reason they do that is injuries, the extended time, and the officials' contract has worked it out. They get paid half, I believe, or something for the fifth quarter. So the fifth quarter, we strongly encourage it in the Tri-Valley League. We try to tell our ADs to tell your coaches, keep the maximum amount you can so the kids get the fifth quarter, but not every school and team have that amount of participation in where you might go to a game, and one game we play 5, and the next one you only play 4. Why is it different? That's why it's different.
So specifically, some sports you might play 5 quarters, A quarter for starters. B quarter would be your second tier or third tier. C quarter, starters again. D quarter, second tier. E quarter, anyway. And it varies sport by sport. And that is to ensure that everybody has to play at the modified level. Volleyball, it might have one system, soccer, another. Baseball, it might be 2 innings, at least one at that. So that's, Paul, that's why I think it's so important that be in there.
I was not questioning the TVL rules, I'm just
Right.
questioning the TVL, and next year might be called something else. So you said league.
Okay.
League
It appears as though the TVL will be in tag
Okay,
next year.
that's fine. Okay. Junior varsity, the purpose of a junior varsity team is to further develop players for the varsity team. Every effort will be made to ensure all players are participating in regularly scheduled contests. And I use those 3 words, regularly scheduled contest, so that it had to be a real game. It cannot be a scrimmage, which is not regularly scheduled. So that I can't go to your son or daughter and say, well, they got into the scrimmage. It's not a regularly scheduled contest. And they have to actually demonstrate the skills and strategies learned during a practice, and players should have the opportunity to compete in game conditions. And it's not the same as competing in the game in the practice session where you have a scrimmage amongst your own players. And again, winning is secondary to player development. Third, of the varsity, the purpose of a varsity team is to compete at the highest level. Playing time will be earned based on skill level, knowledge of strategies, conditioning, and practice performance. And Mr. Zalewski, in his red pen, already showed me we should add attitude, which is fine. I mean, again, this is a draft, it's out here for discussion. These three items, I felt, if you look at the second page here, it's sports participation philosophy is page 4. I thought it should go right after that letter F, because right there you have the philosophy of participation, but now we're actually going to be implementing in that next line, F would be G, what our baseline philosophy is for playing time. That's it. Yes, you may.
I think one of the things that we've talked about, and I mean, this is really for anybody to answer, but I'll direct it towards you. We talked a lot about, and I've heard from parents a lot about cuts and what governs our philosophy regarding cutting from teams and tryouts and things like that at the modified versus junior varsity versus varsity. And I've heard feedback, and I'm not sure what my position is on this, but I've heard feedback from a lot of parents that they feel that one or two alternatives. Either there shouldn't be, if the structure of the sport allows it, there shouldn't be cuts from modified. Or B, if your child is trying out for a team that the issue of the way it's structured, if there's only 5 kids on the field at one time, that they should be actively encouraged to pursue, for example, track or cross country, which really is, I would call it open enrollment sort of. I didn't know if that was something you felt needed to be included in there, or we needed to address that, because I think that that's a concern that I hear often.
Well, I know we discussed it at one point. We were talking about student athletes who went out for a sport, didn't play it, and they went to another sport, became successful at those sports. Now, I thought we talked about it as far as, again, I'm gonna use me, the individual coach saying, Kevin, you're not gonna make the basketball team, maybe you can go play something else, bowling or something else, to see you're a good athlete, you're in good shape, you're a good kid, go do it. Or we're gonna make it a blanket type thing, where, I mean, I think by word of mouth, I don't know if you want it written down that way, or just say, coaches are encouraged to tell their student athletes.
And I've gotten those calls. I mean, I'll use this spring, for example. A young man got cut off of one team and asked if he could try out for another, and I called that coach, and the young man made the other team. So I think that is happening by word of mouth, and I do believe some of our coaches are saying, maybe you should try cross country or golf or tennis or, you know, something of that nature. But again, it's obviously not a blanket statement in our
I guess how do we make sure that
protocols.
it happens universally? I think that there's still, at the other end of that, some coaches, there's still a kid who may or may not have known that they had an opportunity to try for another sport. And forgive me, because my oldest is only in 8th. Do these teams at the modified level, for example, because that's not my only experience, don't they try out at the same time?
Yes, and there's, again, the catch-22 is if a kid gets cut from modified soccer, and let's say there are modified field hockey cuts, it's tough to encourage that kid to go try out for modified field hockey because they've already had their cuts. There's where it becomes, you encourage those student athletes to go out for a sport like cross-country that might not cut. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's a handful of sports that don't cut. So it's, you know, I mean, those would be the only sports, if you will, that should be encouraged for those kids to go participate in, because it would be tough for me to defend, let's say a kid gets cut from soccer, and now field hockey's made cuts, and all of a sudden she goes and makes field hockey, and my daughter or your daughter got cut, how's that possible? You know what I mean? I think there's where, again, it's the catch-22 of you try to encourage those kids to go out for the sports that don't cut. I don't know if there's a perfect solution.
The other thing you mentioned about making cuts at the modified level, again, and I'm going back years, when Clinton had a no-cut policy and I was coaching modified basketball. And I may have had 15, 16 kids, and you might have 20-something kids on the bench, and the coach had to get all these kids into the game. It's impossible, totally impossible, and I don't know how it ruined your program, or didn't ruin your program.
Well, I know for soccer, for modified soccer, there's like 45 kids that try out for modified soccer, so you have to make cuts at that point, or else you're gonna have to split it into two
And I
teams.
don't have necessarily a position related, but I'm just bringing forward a concern that's been brought to me. that I think
Well,
must be
no, I
discussed.
think, but this comes back to you guys, Paul and Beth, because I know Clinton for a while, not to extol Clinton, particularly in his regime, but for a while, at the modified, what they did with girls soccer is they had a large number of girls. So rather than cut, they made 2 teams. And the uniforms were T-shirts, you know, so in other words, in terms of keeping costs down, they're like, look, we're not gonna, you're not all going out here in $90 shirts and shorts, T-shirts, and you gotta bring your own shorts, and there was like a red team and a white team, and the red team, you know, one team traveled and the other team stayed home, and they scheduled all the contestants. I mean, I do think we as a society right now are picking our latest superstars, and before, you know, yeah, I mean, basically in the uterus, we're making determinations about success. And so I have a concern, but you guys I put it in your lap because of the budget, of course, this affects the budget. But it does seem certainly, I don't know if you want to do this at levels above the modified, but it does seem, there are some sports where you can accommodate more kids.
Right.
Because, you know, I think of track and cross country.
Taking
but
the devil's advocate position, or the devil's position, as you mentioned last time. And forgive me as being the board member, if I'm a coach, or an athletic director, and you have 45 kids now with 2 teams. Are you gonna tell the coaches to split up the talent, so the talent is equal on both teams? Or is it A gonna be my better kids, and B's gonna be the kids who may never play another minute of soccer anywhere? And at one point last week, I think you said, we're teaching them life. We're teaching them sometimes you don't make it. And the parents, you know, parents, I'm sorry, your kid's not gonna make the team, even if they, in ASO, they scored all these goals, and they were the star, or literally they batted 800. At some point, we're melding them together, a lot of kids. So and 2 teams, I don't know if you can go out and find competition for 2 teams.
Well, I was gonna say,
That's
they're-
something else, plus busing and
Right,
everything.
again, talk about a catch-22. Rome has tried it, and they did exactly what you said. Like their orange team, and please, with all due respect, they weren't the better kids. So when we play the orange team, we beat them 45-0. But when we play their black team, it's 1-1. You know what I mean? So it's, now so the orange team's not getting anything out of it, our kids aren't getting anything out of it. And I think you're right, now it's gonna become who do you play, just because there's not enough schools that have, for us, we'd have a blue and a red team, so to speak. I just don't know if you're gonna be able to field 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 of those games. And then again, who decides, do you split it down the middle when you do tryouts? I'm not saying it can't be done, so please don't misinterpret that. And this has been discussed, certainly in my 7 years, it's been brought up with the 2-team thing, and I think it still comes back to budget, number one, uniforms, another coach. And then what happens when you go take 45 kids now and they gotta try out for JV? Now you're gonna cut how many kids? 20 kids? I mean, and so now all of a sudden it's, well geez, but my kid made it, I mean, hear it all the time with Little League. My kid was an all-star, but he got cut off modified back. You know what I mean? So, again, somewhere along the line, I just think cuts are inevitable.
Sure.
And I just don't know at what level are we all comfortable with the cuts being made at 7th and 8th grade or 9th and 10th grade with the JV. But again, there's where, I mean, I've tried to study this the best I can, and I've weighed both sides, because again, I think that's the hardest thing any of our coaches will tell you, is when you gotta meet with that young person and tell them, he's sorry you didn't make it. Everybody's crying, the coach is crying, the kids are crying, the varsity coach is choked up, you know, I mean, that's a tough thing for those coaches to have to do.
And I would say from the school board's perspective, that's the purpose of this committee, is advisory, so that we can have a sense of sort of what is the will of, you know, this committee that's representative of the community and the school district. You know, is it that, yes, you know, based on the size of the team and for each sport, their cuts will be made, but then, you know, we make sure that without exception, each child is directed to another one of those, you know, open enrollment type of sports, or a sport that maybe has tryouts in a different way or a different time, because it is challenging if you have a kid who, again, I have one daughter that runs cross country and track, so it's never an issue, and then I have another daughter who's on modified softball, and there were cuts made, and she was, you know, right on the cusp. And, you know, you were, you know, debating, oh, where's she gonna go, and what's she gonna, and I only knew about cross country because my other daughter was already participating, but I wanna make sure that we understand that, okay, this is the philosophy, because it goes back to what we talked about evaluating coaches, and when we get that story back, well, you know, my child got cut, we can say, this is what was discussed. We decide, you know, the will of the committee that's representative was that cuts would be made at the modified level, but every child would be directed towards another sport so they have an opportunity to participate. Or, you know, with Peter's, you know, philosophy, we're gonna make an A team and a B team, or you know, a red team and a blue team. I just would like to, I like to hear it discussed, because I like to hear the different points of view, so that we can understand, you know, what is in general the will, so that we can carry out policy that supports that.
Well, you know, I think, you know, I'd be intrigued to hear what the professionals on the, again, boots on the ground, but, you know, my kids are actively involved in club sports. And predominantly what you're seeing is, there's some kids that are naturals, but then mostly it's the kids whose parents are most engaged. And a lot of those played the sport. And so, my position has always been, until your kid is dragging you there, you have an obedient child, not an athlete. And when your kid, when the light goes on, your kid says, hey, will you get me down to the gym, will you get me to the track, can I go down to the turf? Well then, so to a certain, and for some of those kids, that light doesn't come on until post-modified. So now, acknowledging that the cut issue is real, and yeah, you're right, Paul, I do think we need to teach, that's one of the great things, the lessons they learn in sport, but also, there used to be a modified program that not modified, an intramural program that seemed to me, I don't know that it was ever a vehicle to move kids from non-interscholastic into that, but I don't know, it doesn't seem, you know, certainly I'm unaware of what the intramural offerings are these days.
We're gonna hit that
Okay.
later on.
That was what I was gonna talk about, was the intramurals, because, or we can say it, if we do cut, anybody cuts a coach, however it's done, go and try this, then we're taking that child's want to play that sport away from them, without giving them the skills to try it in that sport, because then that's like, we're making their choices for them, like, as adults, we're trying to guide them to make their own choices, not make choices for them. So they get cut from the program, but then we say go do track, but they don't really want to. We've allowed them to settle and not continue to strive for what they want to do. So that would be my only thing with being nervous about saying, let's have cuts. And if we have cuts, I'm also for, you know, kids becoming successful on their own and, you know, working on their own, but having them guided something else because that's what we think is best for them. And then always listen.
The other point is that we're also working with a genetic timetable. And when kids hit 7th grade, they're all hitting a genetic timetable at a different time. And some kids are reaching puberty in the 7th grade, and some kids are reaching puberty in the 11th grade. And if you tell a kid in the 7th grade that you're not a soccer player, you know, then you're taking out of the equation. That's what frequently happens when you cut kids in modified, is that you basically separated the herd, and those kids who made it in 7th grade sort of continuously by inertia continue to make teams going up. And I think we've all seen the story of a kid. You said, where did this kid come from? You know, in the 10th grade, the 11th grade, all of a sudden a kid grows 6 inches and puts on 30 pounds, and all of a sudden his muscle mass starts catching up with his growth, and it's a totally different athlete. So I'm really kind of opposed to taking kids and separating them and modify just because that's life, because there's this other component of development that I think that is very important to allowing these kids to possibly hit their stride and then And it doesn't even happen in high school by varsity for all kids, but by and large, by the time you reach your junior year, it's much easier to make that determination, I think, or much easier for a coach to pick who he knows is going to be competitive at that time. But I just hate to see kids get separated and then kind of move along by inertia when these other kids, as you say, should be given a chance to thrive in the sport that is their first desire.
So you would advocate either mural program?
I would advocate either multiple modified teams, and I can't say how I feel about how they would be divided. I'd almost like them to be divided equally, or intramural activities that would allow kids. I mean, there are a lot of sports that have club activities, so for a lot of sports it's really kind of not that pertinent, because if you get cut from your high school sport or your modified sport, you can go and play in a club. But I think there are other sports that don't necessarily have a very strong club component to them, and for those sports, maybe even individually, they should be considered to be the only possible developmental ground for these kids.
From my experience, when you have the two modified teams, it is vital that you first decide how you're going to make up those teams. And the first thing you do is, you get two children at the modified level. First of all, get the sisters on that same team. And then, you're the coach, I'm the coach, I get first choice, you get second, third, fourth, and you have a draft just amongst the coaches to make it fair, because that Rome situation was a disaster for both the Rome kids and the competition. So if you are going to go with the two modified teams, so why don't you make a comment, and then I'd like to redirect to three different ways.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna put Mr. Bodie on the spot to comment on it, but him being the only other coach here, I observe the teams and the coaches on a daily basis, and from a supervisory standpoint, the teams that don't, you teach a whole lot less of the skills, and trying to corral 50, 60 kids at a time when you have one coach or maybe two coaches is nearly impossible. So the kids are running to a certain extent helter-skelter, you know, and they're trying to keep, even on, let's say, football, where they're all on a sideline, there's a whole lot of non-football stuff going on, you know, as much as the coaches are trying to, you know, keep everything pointed in the right direction.
I can add to that. I'm using wrestling as an example. I only have so much mat space, and I'm the only coach. So once I get to, you know, over 25, 30 kids max, it becomes tough to get the skills in with the other kids. So it does become, safety is a big issue, skill development. And I think even with some of the other sports, even such as track and field, if the numbers get really big, it could still be a problem for safety and instruction and everything else like Tim was saying.
We've got to do three things with the conversations we've just had. First, we have to look back at the draft that just focuses on the perspective that Mr. Carlson had. Secondly, do we want to add a cut philosophy in regards to this? And third, do we want to make a recommendation to the Board of Education that whenever possible at the modified level, consider to adding two sports at the modified level? That all of a sudden gets thrown into your lap, because you've got to decide, well, we're just going to have the scrimmage vests as uniforms that are reversible, so you get, you know, that sort of thing. You've got to get another coach. You've got to coordinate field space. You know, to be perfectly honest, the expense at the modified level to add that other team is usually around $2,000. If you add another team, and you make your expenses still first. But anyway, so that's a recommendation that has to be made. But first of all, let's go back to your, can we focus on these three things and then get some closure on these three ideas? So, you focused here on, and do we want to add the one word at the end of varsity for attitude? Do we want to add any other issues in regards to these, in regard any other components in regards to what we have here? You get a copy of this draft?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I'm fine with it. I mean, I wrote, I'm fine with it. I was looking for.
Thomas Jefferson had that idea, too.
Yeah.
Well, I think as guidelines, it certainly is gonna be helpful, you know, to me at our coaches meeting, that we can say that, you know, these are guidelines in terms of what coaches should be following. Certainly, I think that gives every coach more of a perspective as to what has been approved, because I would imagine, is this gonna go to the board for approval, or how does this work?
This is going to be a recommendation.
Right,
to the
you know, I mean,
board.
so, you know, what I mean, it's like everything in the coach's handbook, you know, those are Board of Education policies or regulations, so when I go over that, again, it's not the world according to Pete Alvanos, this is what we all have to follow as district employees, so I certainly would welcome something of this magnitude for guidelines, so then, now that's just another evaluation tool with regards to, you know, when you go to that game.
And it is a guide, there's wiggle room in each area except modified.
Correct.
I talked with Todd Nelson, who's the assistant director at New York State. He says the state has no guidelines for JV or varsity, it's up to the schools.
So would there be, on the modified, with like pretty much everybody plays and learns, would there be any type of rules? Like say, one of the athletes doesn't come to practice, or somebody's
Yes.
being, you know, because then you're bringing down those kids that wanna learn just because somebody's parent wanted them on the team.
Yeah, that's, you're bringing up a very important point. You've got on the modified team, everybody has to play, but Jimmy is being disciplined here. He doesn't get in that game because he, you know, did something inappropriate, or he missed two, you know, didn't follow. He does not play, so even though it says they have to play, he doesn't play.
I mean, they
Okay?
would still have to follow the
Yeah.
athletic code of conduct, and if you
Okay.
have any team rules on top of that.
Yeah,
You're still the coach, you decide if they violated one of the athletic code of conduct rules and/or your team rules, then they don't, you know what I'm saying? It's not just they play because we said they play, they still have to follow your team's rules.
we spent about maybe 8 hours one time on that issue, because what happened was, a coach, and one of our league coaches, the kid was being disciplined, so what he did is, well, I'm not letting you play the first quarter. He played the second quarter and scored 900 points. You know, it's not quite the kind of, you know, fifth quarter concept. So, you know, every time you have a rule, all of a sudden it takes, oh my goodness, but you're making an excellent point. Okay? We have-
I would just be cautious of the word attitude, and I'm just saying that based on what I've been advised by legal counsel in certain meetings that I've had, because that is a very subjective tone that I've been
Well,
told.
their philosophy here is got proper mental attitude.
I'm just telling you, that's certainly something, but when you put it on a coach's criteria sheet, that's certainly something that, I'm just, again,
Well, I guess my thinking is,
I'm with you, I understand what we're looking for.
lacking in that word, a parent comes to the coach and says, hey, my kid's like the best shooter here, he's the fastest runner, and he knows more about this game than anybody else. But if his attitude isn't good, or he's dismissive to the coach, or any other reason, then you don't have a fallback position to say, that's why he's not playing. That's
Right.
why I suggested inserting that
No,
word
I agree.
attitude as being
I'm-
second to
I-
skill level,
I support-
perhaps,
I
or
support
it could be
the word
first, but.
I'm just,
Yeah, might be the best shooter, but hasn't learned the word pass yet. Yeah. Right, okay.
Yeah, I would, if it would be appropriate to make a motion, I would so move, but I have a question that was grind us to a halt. But here's another question I have. Is junior varsity, which I like Paul's description, but I'm a senior who's not good enough for varsity, but man, my heart is in the game. Are we gonna, do we consider junior varsity to be available to those, is this a one direction level? That's the way it always
Yeah.
was when I was a kid.
There are two exceptions to that. One, you let with league permission, you let a foreign exchange senior play, and most of the time, you would inform the other opponents that you're allowing a junior
Okay.
to play on JV.
So there are rules about that.
That's a gentleman's agreement that you let the rest of the league know, we got a junior, you know, we want him to go out there. It is, I can't think of in 3 decades when we've ever allowed a senior to be on varsity. Junior is an exception, or JV, I mean, yeah. but I'd say, anybody else remember a senior and a junior needs, you have to explain to them.
Really appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah, when
Because
you
of the philosophy.
Have they ever been let on if a school was starting a program and it was called a JV team before they even got to the varsity?
Yes, that was one example where that did happen, somebody who might have been starting lacrosse, for example, or, and then you said, we're just starting at the JV level, and we do have some seniors on the team. And that was permitted as long as your opponents knew, and, you know, this senior has no skill, and we're out there for that reason. There are always exceptions like that, but that's a real good example.
Can I ask a sandwich question? I think that, the other two things I've heard, and again, it's not based on my own experience. When younger players play up, so like 8th and 9th graders who are just very talented and play up at JV, and I don't know if they ever play up at varsity.
Okay.
Do we have a governing philosophy about that? Because I've heard, and again, not based on my own experience, from different parents feel completely, and they're all stakeholders, and they all feel completely different. Some feel like there's no reason why an 8th or 9th grader should be moved up to JV or varsity because they're throwing off a 10th grader who really wants to be there, and why should we do that? And then on the flip side of Peter's question is there's a senior who's really not good enough, but he played, you know, his freshman, sophomore, junior year, and now you're gonna throw him off in his senior year just because it was a really good freshman moving up? How could you do that? So do we have a philosophy that sort of governs that? Like, do we have a point of view on that? Because those are the types of things, I'm sure Paul has heard that, I've heard that, I would imagine he probably got a couple of phone calls about that.
Well, let me start with the select classification process. That's when you're moving a 7th or 8th grader up to a JV into a varsity. There are set agility, physical education tests that student athlete must pass. And the first one, before you can even test them, it's called a Tanner score, his or her physical body maturity level. If that's not a certain level, I can't even test them. Now and then it's it's probably more in minority than it is majority. I've always told the coach that if there is a 7th or 8th grader that they feel is good enough, they have to feel that kid is gonna play 50% or more of the time. It's not a move a young person up to fill a roster. Because my first year here, I didn't even know what the heck select classification was. A couple kids got moved up and they sat on the bench, and those parents beat me down and said, geez, you move my kid up and sit on the bench, they would have been. So now, I've kind of made that a 50% or more, not just to move a kid up. So that's kind of the select classification, and again, I think somewhere on here I saw specialization. I think there's where coaches that work with student athletes year-round, maybe not coach them, but they do go to these games, that's how they're evaluating, almost like, I hate to say this, but almost like a college coach recruiting talent. You go to the Rising Star Complex and there's all kinds of soccer being taken place. If I go there and I see this young kid, 7th grade or 8th grade, ooh, he's pretty good, or she's pretty good, that's one that I've got my eye on. So they recommend them to me. And again, it's usually the minority as opposed to the majority when you're moving a kid up. Our coaches have tried, and I'm totally against cutting seniors for that very reason that you said, but there's why, going back to your point, juniors sometimes they won't put a junior on JV because they really don't want to have to cut that student athlete next year if they're a senior, if they're not good enough to make the varsity. That's why kind of the unwritten rule, if you will, the varsity is usually 11th and 12th graders with, again, some sophomores and 9th graders and sprinkled in. Your JVs are usually your 9th and 10th graders with some 8th graders sprinkled in, and then your modified is your 7th and 8th grade. If that answers your question.
Just a side note here, my sport is completely different. Gymnastics, we only have varsity. We do have club, but just growing up in sports and athletics, my brother was big into football here. If we followed this, the modified, the junior varsity and the varsity, and you had that all fall into place, regardless of if they were in 7th grade or 8th grade or a senior or a junior. If you're following the skill level, the attitude, the knowledge, the strategies, and the conditioning, then it all falls into place. But if you're following that, if you're making an exception for one and not the other, then no, then that's where people get upset, children get hurt, parents get upset. But if you're following this to the book, then there shouldn't be a problem with it. You know, talent is talent. Kids can learn talent over years, but if we don't follow something, then sure, that's where we're gonna get into a problem.
I would also say anytime you start to make rules that are denying talented athletes the opportunity to achieve their potential, I think you're going down a very bad path in terms of overall quality of program that you're really offering. So I would be strongly opposed to manipulating the system to prevent select classification athletes from participating at a level at which their competency dictates.
And we have to report that, you know, when you 3 times a year. So if I test 6 kids in the fall, that has to go to every school in the section, it has to go to the section. So I think the section does look at that for either roster filling or, you know what I mean, as far as trying to dot your i's and cross your t's, so to speak. So that is, so it's not being abused, I guess is the correct way of saying that.
I have a very particular bias in regards to selection classification, and that is, you've got kids that are skilled, they meet the criteria, but I think parents and school districts forget one big part of that, and which I think should be a criteria, and that is the emotional part. Do you want that 7th or 8th grader hanging around with a senior? And all the different interests that a senior has, and can that 7th or 8th grader, who might be a very talented athlete, on the foul line, they miss the shot at the end of the game, if they're in that spot, you know, you got a senior, you choked again, you say that to your buddy, that's one thing, but you say that to a 7th or 8th grader, you know. So I agree with you, but I think we also always have to think of the emotional component as well. And I don't think we do that enough. We want that kid hanging around because an 8th grade is different than a senior, in 9 million ways. But that, I have to get that out because I've been stewing about that for years. Okay, now that I've pontificated there, let's, so we have a consensus with this draft here. And would add the attitude.
Between skill level and knowledge and strategy.
Okay. And secondly, do we want to include a perspective about roster size and how we put the roster together in regards to modified JV and varsity? Paul just looked at the playing time issue. Do we want to add a component to this in regards to New Hartford's philosophy, in regards to keep roster size and what our philosophy will be at those 3 levels?
I would actually like to further consider that, but I would keep it separate from this. I would kind of like, once your team is set, these are your guidelines. Because this, you know what I mean, it seems to me they're separate issues. You know, once I get my team, this is how I run my team. The other one is, what does my team look like?
Mm-hmm.
It may seem like a fine line.
Okay, so separate from this,
yeah.
Do we want to make that recommendation to the Board of Education, though? This is going to go to the board as a recommendation with regards to the mission statement. Do we want the next part to be part of the mission statement in regards to philosophy and selecting the roster?
Much information is going to be best for all.
I think that the reason, and I don't think we're calling this a mission statement, I think what we talked about, the modified university with the objectives for each.
Okay, so,
I think we're good.
okay. I was gonna have this kind of be.
Because I think the mission statement is the thing in the box on the top.
It is.
This would be
This I
kind of
envision
sports
to be a,
participation philosophy,
okay,
page 4, which is
Okay.
on the back of that.
right, okay.
The playing time thing is a very fascinating issue, because on the one hand, baseball is the classic example, in my experience, and none of my kids play baseball. after Little League. But it is, you've got, as Pete said, you got all these all-stars, so you got, what, 12 or 14 all-stars moving up, and there were 12 or 14 all-stars that moved up last year, which give us 24 to 28 kids for roughly, what, 12 or 13 spots?
We kept 19, I think, this year.
Well,
It's-
but that's
But
big.
still,
That's
that's
huge.
6 that all-stars that aren't on there.
You know, and that excludes all the other boys too, so there's a huge number of kids coming up. So that's one issue, like, are we really gonna limit, let's say we've got 20 boys, 20 girls in each grade that wanna play on softball and baseball, and 10 spots in each grade. Do we wanna eliminate 50%? As a district, do we wanna say that 50% of those athletes, your career's over in the 7th grade, for all intents and purposes? I mean, some of those kids are gonna be dogged and come back. I think a different issue, which I have heard about, which I find intriguing, is, I'm gonna cut one kid.
That's what I was.
You know, that seems to be totally different
One
from,
out of 50 or one out of anything?
well, let's say, you know, this is a, you know, example I've heard is where I'm gonna cut the 21st kid from soccer. I'm thinking, well, geez, you got 20, you need 22 kids, you need 11 on each side. It would seem to me you wouldn't cut the 21st kid, but I'm not there, I didn't watch, so I'm not judging any of that, I'm just saying, do we wanna cut the 20th kid? Can we keep 21? Can we keep, you know, what is, the straw that breaks the camel's back? Because in certain circumstances, we're saying we got enough for 2 teams. In certain circumstances, and other circumstances, we're saying, I'm gonna cut one child. And do we have, you know, do we feel differently about that at varsity than we do at modified? I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and in terms, particularly in terms of, you know, going back to a sport as an element of
So we're
education.
cutting one, or are we gonna cut 2?
Right.
Or are we gonna cut, or am I gonna cut?
Or
3?
if there's 21,
I
are
know.
we gonna keep 21 or are we gonna keep 20? And what,
Number.
Well, there's not a number. I've strongly discouraged cutting one kid for that very reason. I mean, I've even gone a step further and said, if you have 25 uniforms, try to keep 20, try to find a way to keep 25 for that very reason. So this is the first I'm hearing about a one-cut situation. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but that's certainly not within the philosophy when I have my coaches' meetings. I've always said, if you get to, let's say, 20, and 21 and 2 and 3 are down here, then maybe 20 is your guideline because of talent level, but never because of trying to keep a certain number. You know, and I'll use the baseball one that we just had. You know, I was told by three coaches that did the tryouts, probably numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19 were all the same, but 20 was much, that's why they opted to keep those last 4 kids as opposed to just keeping 16 and cutting it. So I've always tried, the measuring stick for me has always been, as you grade those kids, if the number's here and then the next talent level's there, there's your separation, but it's never been a uniform thing, not from my perspective anyway. So I think that maybe that's something that we do need, as Danielle said, the more we have down, the more, I mean, again, I think, listen, I'm all for the more things you have down, again, because it gives coaches a better understanding of what their expectations are, but it does get into now, the more rules you have, the more policing you have, the more, you know what I'm saying? I mean, those are things that are gonna come along with all this, which is certainly fine if that's the direction the committee wants to recommend to the board, they will accept those recommendations.
Can I add? I'm sorry for changing, it's being pulled in so many places.
Sure.
Mr. Real, that's a good point, because years ago, I wanna say at least 8, if not 9, I had to deal with a situation at the junior high where a youngster was cut, and a female athlete. And the ramifications of that was that only one cut, to jump on what you're saying, that student never went out for another sport again because of that. On the flip side of that, whenever I dealt with situations relevant to that since then, and this is almost a decade ago, I think coaches, and I'm wrong, I think they have an unofficial rule where they cut at least 2 or more. In my dealings with every situation that's pertained since then, I mean, I'm not getting into 1 versus 2, but 1 is definitely hurtful. And I understand that, and that was a real life experience. But since then, I'm not aware of that. I call it an unofficial rule because I don't think it's documented anywhere, but I don't believe, in my dealings with coaches, that that's happened. in my view.
Well, look, I think it's a difficult topic, which is why I raise it.
Right, no.
Because in certain circumstances, if the one kid is disruptive, for whatever reason, if the one kid is destructive to the creation of a team, I'm gonna leave it to the coach to make the determination. On the other hand, we are talking, particularly at the modified level, with children. We're not, these are children, and in every sense of that word. And we, our community, as a group, are educators, and so I'm, you're right, more rules create more trouble, but to a certain extent, I don't know if we ever had a discussion here in the district about what our thoughts are when it comes to that. I mean, obviously, 30 kids come out, you keep 15, that's an easier, that's a much easier circumstance in ways, because, there's the shared misery, I guess. But I just didn't know if it was ever raised. That was a topic that's out there, and you hear these stories.
And I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going back a decade.
Not only do we have to raise it, I think we have to help if we're ever in this situation. And to your point about the disruptive kid, the kids we like the least need it the most.
Right.
There's a kid that's, he needs it, she needs it.
What do we counsel? We have a coach's handbook that we read, that each coach reads, but, is there, because I am very, what Pete Alvinos just said, I think the more that we write down, in some respects, comes back to bite the coaches in the behind. This is like, if we say, we'll only cut 2 or more, but then we get to that one disruptive kid, or the one kid who only tried out because his mother maybe doesn't really want to play, and the coach isn't that good, so they decide to come. That's what, when, from the perspective of the board, that's what exposes the district to liability. Someone say, well, here's your rule, it's written down, you clearly violated this rule. It doesn't matter in some ways, sometimes, how good the explanation is for that. But I'd like to think.
But I think that's why we went to, and again, this wasn't a board directive, but it went to coaches coming up with criteria and grading kids. I mean, they, whether some coaches give kids a number, so they don't know if it's Bob, Mary, or Joe's, and they're grading those kids on sport-specific skills. So at the end of the 5-day tryout, and they sit down and tabulate the scores, they kind of know if 70 is the cutoff, 69 and below, depending on what number or what sport it is. And I've had those, but I'm saying I've had that conversation with several moms and dads to say, listen, your son or daughter graded out poorly in these 3 categories where that's where they lost points. So the average was 6 out of 10, your son or daughter got a 2, then the next, so there's where they lost points with you, if you will, during the tryout. So that's how the coach was able to clearly define.
And you think that, and again, I don't have an answer, legitimately a question. Do you think that takes precedent over, 22 kids trying out and 2 kids getting cut, or 1 kid getting cut?
Well, I think, again, I don't think it's ever gonna take precedent over a kid getting cut.
I guess
That's the
I'm
hardest
saying-
phone call you're
I'm
ever
saying,
gonna take.
What do we say to our coaches? Do we say, look, it's not really in the handbook, but you should know that in New Hartford, if you have, if you're keeping 15, you want 15 kids and 16 kids try out, you better have a really, we really try not to cut 1 or 2 kids from the team. Do you know what I'm saying?
I'd like to
I'm asking a
recommend,
question.
if you're in that situation, we've got possibility of 3, 2, or 1 cuts, then that coach has to consult with the AD and the head coach about the situation, so there are 3, because I tend to think the modified coaches are probably the least experienced, and that might be
Again,
a
right
way.
on page 24, before making cuts, each coach must call and meet with the athletic director to review the process so that consistent procedures are followed.
Does that happen?
Sure, because I know I'm getting that call, so I wanna make sure they, and that's why now I've even made sure our varsity coaches attend tryouts for the, it happens more in the modified than it does in JV and varsity with regards to the calls, and the cuts. I think that's the underlying issue, and again, I apologize if it has happened, but in 7 years, I don't recall us cutting 1 or 2 kids. I think 3 or more, and I've never said there's a magic number, but I remember when Mr. Gilligan and I interviewed that there was an issue with varsity baseball, they put 2 kids back. because there was 18 jerseys or whatever that situation was. So I've tried to become very conscientious of how many jerseys do we have, how many kids are trying out, and that's why I've tried to say, use talent level as your measure, not a number. You know what I'm saying? Or
Yeah,
not
no, I hear what you're
just because, to me, and that's why the grading became that much more important as far as I was concerned, because every kid was getting a grade, so that that's what the coach saw on that day of the children trying out.
When is the herd divided? How many kids, when we relate to hockey, we have hockey travel teams, I don't know how many kids travel on every team, they have bantams and everything else. How many kids play on AAU travel teams? You only have 12 all-stars. How come you don't have 14 all-stars? You know, I mean, the herd is divided before they even get here to find sports, some of them. And you can tell, and the coaches know who the players are gonna be when they get here because of what's been going on in the community. And you gotta keep the kids that you know, and I'm totally against two teams, okay? But if you're gonna have two soccer teams per se, you carry the best kids you can with, and I don't know, I don't like uniforms being the criteria, because if you had 20 kids and now you cut one kid because you don't have uniforms, go find a uniform. But then you got, well, you can find another uniform for 27th kid, and you can find a 23rd kid, and it goes on and on. I think we're in a non-winning situation when it comes to cuts, because somewhere along the line, I as the parent am gonna find a weak link where it says something about cuts. And I just think these kids,
So you're gonna go back and it's very consistent.
I think that what happened was that at the beginning of tryouts, you tell if there's 20 kids that are trying out, at the first day of practice, you say, we're taking 15. So tomorrow, 14 come back, and the next day 13, and the next day 12, we're at 11, still 15 make it.
you have a very unique sport, okay, very unique. You have those children from tabletop high all the way up.
Except at the high school level. At the high school level, I take anybody.
Okay,
Everybody.
but you've known those children, students, and their families all the way up as they've gone in
Some
their
of them,
gymnastics.
but like my team was 15 and I only have 5 in my gym. The other 10 are completely high school,
Where'd they come from?
the school.
They've never were in your gymnasium before?
No. They take them and they put that, I don't give them, they don't have to have ever touched the equipment. They have to have the certain amount of practice that the section says, and I make the best routine I can for them.
They never worked out in your gym?
10 of them.
Wow. Excuse me. You tell those kids get up and have bells, man.
I don't make them.
No, I know you don't, I
They
know.
just do what
They do what they
Well,
want,
no,
that's
and I don't
amazing.
really speak just on my sport, I just think in, my family is huge in football, huge in football. Shawnee was at, Hofstra, he was one of those 7th graders that was brought up. But you need rules and boundaries, and the children need the rules and boundaries to know how to succeed in life. And if you go in the first day telling them, you know, the attitude word is everybody's perception is different. So my perception of this attitude is different than your perception of an attitude, which is different than yours. But if you go in with the rules, and yes, I understand the liability stuff, but if you go in 15 or making it, it would break my heart to cut one. It would. But if we have an intramural program, if we have something to offer them, then next year you work it. And I know that in Rome that's happened before. They cut one kid off the JV team. It happened to be my best friend. She asked the coach what she needed to do. They said, you know, do the intramural program. He can be the ball boy. He, you know, traveled with the team. He did all that. He felt a part of it. And the next year he made it. And then 2 got cut the next year. But they followed that rule.
I want to tip my hat to you too for winning sectional championship with 10 kids you never saw at the high school. In gymnastics?
Well, I do have in my notes that Paul Pietrowski was enlightened today.
Put it in there.
Don't
Keep
worry.
them over. Not over.
Okay.
But I, you know, Dick, just following up on what Pete said, I think that's, you know, you can't govern for fear of the parents. We are the educators, not me, but you guys, I'm the parents. Can't be afraid of them. But 2, I like the idea that, you know, I think of this as the board sets the policy. They hand it to Mr. Knoll. Mr. Knoll tells Mr. Albanos what he wants implemented, and then Mr. Albanos implements it. So the idea that the coaches meet with the athletic director to make sure what the board has passed down is being done, that seems to me to be the way to do it. And then, it's not necessarily a hard, fast number or a rule, but Mr. Albanos is gonna sit with a coach and discuss what this year's crop has presented and how that problem's gonna get solved. Seems to me to be a really intelligent way to approach it. And that way the board can be sure that whatever it passed down to Mr. Knoll and on to Mr. Albanos was implemented at the 3 levels that we offer. And then it's not you gotta cut 2 or more, because then a kid who might have made the team's gotta go because we gotta cut 2. Well, we're gonna keep you, but, you know what I mean? It seems to me that that's a really intelligent solution to the problem, is let the professionals implement the policy that is promoted at the board. And then if the parents don't like the policy, they come to the board and say, change it. You know, it seems and certainly if I were coaching at the time, I'd wanna know, look, what is the standard you're holding me to? I just wanna know what you want me to do, and then I'll go do it. You tell me not to cut anybody, I won't cut it. I'm gonna cut 10, I'll do whatever you tell me to. Just tell me what it is. And that seems to me to be a really, I realize that's a great solution.
Okay, so, I wanna make sure we have a consensus on this aspect, and we don't want to add this to the recommendations regarding sports philosophy, because we think we already have it there. Am I saying that right? Or help me make sure I have this. We think we have the philosophy in regards to cuts incorporated already in the handbook. And we're just make sure we evaluate our coaches on that. Or do we need something a little more concrete?
It seems to me that the philosophy and the procedure is viable and doesn't really need modification.
Okay, so what we're saying then, the cut philosophy,
I don't think it should be something we should include.
okay.
That's my personal opinion.
Anybody else? Okay. Then, we've got to quickly hit the recommendation regarding 2 teams. And if we are hearing that probably, at least somebody has said it's absolutely against the 2-team philosophy to modify, do we want to make any recommendations regards to intramurals and extensions of the phys ed program, or or let's take a look at that. The 2 teams, do we want to make a recommendation to the board regarding adding a team if the roster is really high at the modified level? So at field hockey, you typically keep 15, you have 33 out. Do we want to add another modified field hockey team, or is that something we want to touch as a recommendation to the board?
I would ask Pete first, how many circumstances would you say in a given year we're looking at the possibility of 2 teams?
Well, your bigger sports, again, soccer sometimes can be year to year. You know, sometimes you're gonna get 25 to try out, some years you're only gonna get 28. So that would be one where it's not a consistent number. But I can tell you baseball, you're always getting about 40 kids to try out. And then boys basketball, 7th and 8th grade, you're usually getting 25 at each 7th grade and 8th grade level. Those are your 3 major ones, and then like I said, soccer will fluctuate year to year. That would be your other boys and girls soccer, modified. So those are your 5 sports. I mean, that's why I say a kid that gets cut from modified soccer, I usually try to tell them to go see if you can help field hockey if you've ever done that. But I can tell you, field hockey, girls lacrosse, those are numbers that we've, in my 7 years, we haven't cut in those 2 sports, because the numbers are right around that 15 to 18, and they could probably take 23 or 5. But those 5 that I mentioned with regards to the modified levels, those are the ones that are usually the most contentious, if you will, with regards to cuts.
Is it viable to have, in Hartford, to have a add another basketball team or baseball team?
Well, again, my personal opinion, I think right now, the toughest thing is finding competition for those folks to play. I mean, we went through it this past year just in basketball. You know, we tried to go to Syracuse for 7th and 8th grade, and that was good, but the season was too short, and we were getting home late. And then this year, we tried to play a Center State schedule, and the lopsided 90-2 scores weren't doing anybody any good. So to add another team, I like the intramural thing. I will be honest with you, point blank, is what fields are they gonna use? Even with soccer, I mean, right now, I'm.
Who would coach it?
Yeah, well, who would coach, but what fields, and then basketball, there's not a second that's not used in these facilities, so I like the club sport and the intramural thing, I just don't know where you put them all. That's the major thing that I deal with, you know, even now with the youth basketball or whatever other sports that wanna come in, town programs, I mean, these gyms are packed till 10, 11 at night, on top of adult education and everything else, so it's a tough thing. That would be my only concern with saying a blanket statement of 2 teams, because you get it budgeted for, and then next year I come back and go, oh geez, we don't need it, take it back because there's not enough.
We'll always take the money back, don't worry about it.
Right, but then it's that following year after you take it back, and I got 40 kids out, you know what I mean? I think there's the rub right there. Just hasn't been enough consistency with regard to
Would it be like Mr. Rail said, leave it to professionals, and if you saw an influx of people trying out for a particular team, you can come to the board or come to a representative of your own and say, look, we have so many kids going out for a team, this might be a time when we go to 2 teams.
We would have to find a second set of coaches.
Right, but I'm thinking baseball, if you have 2 baseball teams and there's no games today, where are they both gonna practice on a rainy day?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying with fields, look at modified soccer. They split that field, that huge field, boys are on one end and girls are on the other. Or they try to operate time differences just because there's no other field for them to practice on.
And I know, when we're playing games for modified soccer, the boys, you know, if you're away, you know the girls are at home. If you add another team just for the boys, you're taking a practice day away from both boys and the girls, because one, that second team needs the entire field to play that game. You're taking an entire practice day.
Would that's what if we had another boys team in soccer, would you have to have another girls team at the time? Would you have to open it up and say, guess what, this year,
Right? That's a whole nother, I don't know, can of worms.
No, I'm speaking of ignorance. How extensive is the intramural program here at Hartford? Do you have
0.
0?
Not expensive.
You like that, eh?
Well, I think intramural, I mean, again, you gotta help me here, but once all these club teams and travel teams, and I think, to me, that's probably what took away a lot of intramurals. I mean, I would imagine, I mean,
Absolutely, I think it's club teams that took away
You know what I mean?
intramural competition. It seems like logistically, this just isn't gonna work for us to recommend to the board to form 2 teams. Unless, as someone said, in a given year, you see it as being an important criteria. And following through with the overall philosophy, I think that you would be looking to the varsity coach for guidance as well, because if the varsity coach is looking down at, say, I mean, I know that this happens in basketball, that these varsity coaches know who the kids are coming into 7th grade, who they expect are going to follow and ascend this ladder. And if he looks down and says, geez, you know, I'm having a hard time saying that we should just have 1 team here, maybe we should think about it, then you do have that option. But I think that for us to say that it should be the philosophy is probably going to be logistically a nightmare.
Okay. Next. Is there more? We are only done with number 1.
Rocket it.
Well, it's important we discuss these things. Guys, what I'd like to do now is take a 3-minute break, because our next topic is going to be protocol for parent meetings. There's 2 purposes of the break. Mr. Bowlby has been kind enough to share with us parent guardian preseason meeting. I'd like the committee to take a look at this, and this also will give an opportunity for you people to want to decide who you'd like to be a spokesperson and some of the issues that you'd like to bring up at the end. That'll give you an opportunity to do that as well. Okay? So, let's take a look at this, if you can come up with any other types of things, and I'm going to defer to you as to what are the expectations, because in going through this, you say that that is a mandatory meeting to be held, and, but I'd like everybody to take a look at this, somebody has some things to chat down.
I mean, I don't want to prolong this meeting any longer than we have to, but it would seem to me that if people here have different opinions, I don't know how they're gonna necessarily have a consensus about what they think is important, because there's a number of different people. I think maybe everybody should have a chance to speak who wants to speak.
Okay? Who do you call my wife? No, I'm teasing. Okay, well, let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean,
And then, you trust me to decide?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Will you call my wife and tell her that it's just? Okay.
What's her, I'll text her.
She never answers mine. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this, and if you want to talk through, Jamie actually.
We're just gonna hit a couple points, we're not gonna take up a lot of time. I mean, you guys have spent a lot of time here about it.
Okay.
We wanna discuss what you just discussed, and then maybe one general blanket statement, so.
I'm calling my wife about you.
I don't have that.
Yeah, we did.
No, I didn't. I got this right here. That I didn't. Mr. Bowler gave it to me.
You mind? Yeah. That's the one thing I did learn. If somebody says to do something, always accept it. You know? Okay, let's take a look at Mr. Bowlby's template here. And to start it off, I do have a question. You do permit, number 4 here, teams to
Yes.
establish their own
Yes.
rules, like everybody
Yes.
eats in the cafeteria on game day, or wear a tie, or
Yeah.
shine the shoes, you know, whatever. Okay,
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, what Kevin's template here is certainly something that we talk about, you know, again, 3 times a year in our coaches meeting. Again, I tell our coaches it's mandatory for them to have a meeting, but we can't make it mandatory for parents to attend the meeting. You know, there's where the catch-22 again is, just, I guess it's never been a policy that it's mandatory for parents to attend, so I've followed that, but it is mandatory for coaches to have one. Some of our coaches, you know, use soccer, they have one parent meeting for all 3 levels, both boys and girls. Some coaches like to have just a varsity parent meeting, and then that varsity coach will go to the JV meeting and the modified parent meeting. So, again, there's no set policy on one overall program meeting. My personal opinion is, I like the one all 3 level meeting, because those 7th and 8th grade parents get to see who the varsity coach is, the JV coach, and also the modified. and they're hearing the team rules, because most of our teams that have rules, it is rules for the inclusive within the program. I think the other thing that I've tried to stress to our coaches is certainly the daily procedures, the practice times. Again, as a parent, if you tell me practice is at 3 o'clock and you expect me to get my son there, I'm gonna get him there at 3. But if you tell me practice is over at 5 and I'm there at 5 and they're not done until 5:15, as a parent, I got a problem with that. So, again, those are things that I share with our coaches. Now, code of conduct, again, the New Hartford Athletic Code of Conduct has to be read in its entirety to the students. I've added the New York State Public High School Athletic Association Code of Conduct for spectators, student athlete code of conduct, and also coaches code of conduct in their coaching package, and that's, they go over this as well. Yeah.
That's on page 80, and that's something that I make copies of, and I'll pass that out to parents.
So again, I think those are certainly things, and again, each team or each coach is allowed, to have their own team rules. I know some of our coaches, more at the varsity level, if they get a phone call from the high school that a kid was disrespectful in study hall or got an ISS, they might have to run extra or sit shorter or something of that nature. Again, I try to, the playing time thing, as we've been discussing for the first hour and a half, again, I make sure our coaches go over that. That's, as a parent, I wanna know why my child, or what it's gonna take my child to get on the field. And then the parent-coach communication guidelines. I wasn't here last meeting, but I know that was discussed. I tell our coaches, you have to make time for parents. That's one thing that I truly believe is important. Now, again, I always try to tell our coaches, when a parent approaches you, make sure it's in a setting that you're comfortable with. I mean, and I'm just going off of past experience. As a coach, I was always uncomfortable talking to a parent before or after a game because I'm thinking about the game, or before or after a practice because it could have been a bad practice or whatever. So I've told them, you have to meet with them, but set up a time that's conducive, that it's not before or after practice or game. So that's something, and again, I'm firmly convinced that we have to make time for parents. That's what our roles are. If I got an issue with a math teacher, I'm sure that math teacher's gonna listen to me, wanna know why my son or daughter is not doing well. So I feel that we have the same obligation as coaches to parents in our district. So that's kind of my overall view, if you will, with regards to our coaches meeting and what the expectation is for parent meetings.
Are there anything from our committee here that you'd like clarified or anything that should be?
I would add on this too, this is just what I use, these are some of the main points that I like to hit on. As far as academics, that's something that I work with the parents on. If a kid is struggling with their grades, I'll work with the guidance department. Sometimes I'll meet with the kids once a week with the parents' permission and go over the assignments that they're doing or not doing. That's just something that I individually do, being in the building. I would also add injuries, and mention Mr. Abraham also, procedures with injuries. If a kid's at home is showing signs of being injured, sometimes they don't want to tell the coach, things along those lines. Nutrition, miscellaneous section for nutrition, things that can be doing at home, and support at home as well.
So that's important. Especially the whole concussion thing that you put, that whole protocol that's being established now, it's important for parents to understand. And you have to kind of rely on parents because it might not present itself until 8 o'clock at night when the kid's trying to do their math homework.
We have, with a lot of the other schools that we work with, and some of the schools we work with have mandatory parent meetings for the entire athletic program. Some of them do it every year where it's individual, but the nice part, I'm not advocating it, but the nice part is we can go over the concussion policy for that individual school district when all the parents are there. But it gets addressed one way or another.
Okay, good. Any other issues in regards to this template?
What's the timing of the meeting?
What do you mean?
When is the meeting held, right, the week before? Do you, would you prefer to hold it in the fall for the winter and the winter for
We usually
spring?
hold it held before the first contest,
Right.
as being scrimmage or a game, but we tried, earlier the better.
But I assume it's the rosters, right?
Well, I see some coaches do it different, again, like soccer, well, soccer will do it before, so that everybody knows what the cut policy is and tryouts, et cetera. Some wait for the roster to be set to now go over, here's the team, here's our team rules, so on and so forth. So, again, it is before the first contest, but there is no set, do you do it before tryouts or after?
I think when that meeting occurs depends on what sport it is, like track and cross country, they can have their meeting before the first event because they're not making cuts. I think the meeting, the parent meeting should be before tryouts so that the parents know, as well as when the parents go home, they tell the children what the guidelines for tryouts are, like what the trials will be based on, not just after cuts are made, so that nobody really knows why trials are cut.
So you're recommending that we should have parent meetings prior to tryouts?
Yeah.
I'm fine with that too.
Yeah, that addresses some of the concerns, but, you know, that addresses two of the issues.
Correct.
Well, you know, there was an interesting situation, which I agreed with, but a coach over fall sports said in the spring, here's what I expect. You know, you will, it's a varsity sport, so I thought was perfectly appropriate, but you will be in shape. I will not get you in shape, and if you're not in shape, you will not make the team. Because you're not here to get in shape, you're here to play. That's what the summer's for. And there was a returning senior who had significant playing time as a junior, who was cut because he spent the summer on his backside when the rest of the underclassmen did not. And I don't have, again, I think that's actually a good life lesson. But that's something that's gotta be, I don't know if that needs to be a parent meeting, but certainly the expectations of the athletes needs to be conveyed to them. You know, if we're gonna say, meeting the week before, hey, this is what I'm expecting from you, and the kids that knew that are ready, and the kids that didn't aren't, you know what I mean? You don't wanna create unreasonable expectations. So if there are expectations from the coaches or the department, I don't know if that's conveyed at a parent meeting or conveyed through a handout or on the website. It does seem to me if there are specific expectations, that they somehow be conveyed to the athletes in a manner and at a time in particular, that they can be ready to roll.
The sheets that you described earlier about the scoring, are those sheets so that they know what the specific evaluation criteria are they shared with the kids beforehand?
Yeah, most of our coaches will have a player information meeting, like I use soccer. They're already planning on June 7th to have their, you know, anybody interested in soccer, here's the handouts, here's tryouts, here's the criteria, here's what I'm gonna be available in the summer, so on and so forth. Now, the criteria sheet should not and cannot have any off-season criteria that neither makes or breaks. That's not my rule, that's the state.
Well, I'm sort of talking about what I guess
But
what
that's
Peter's
my
saying.
point.
You're talking about the rubric,
Well, the rubric and.
explain to the kids.
Because,
Right.
let's say, for example, you have a sport that starts in April. If one of those requirements is the kid in shape, there's not much you're gonna do about it the week before. So I wonder, is that something like, you know, if my son is interested in trying out for hockey, and he's only 9, so it's totally making this up. Would it be helpful to have available on the website, and say, dude, if you're thinking about hockey next year, well, let's take a look at what they're looking for, so that you can work on that over the summer and develop it, and, you know, if he wants you to be able to, again, making it up, run a 10-minute mile, 9-minute mile, and you have to be able to do this, where are you on here? Because I think that, for me, you know, as a parent, the more that you can see, the more you can prepare your kid. So if you're, I would never say to my child whether they stunk at hockey. You can't try out, there's no way you're making that team. But you at least try and adjust their expectations and say, okay, look, here's what they're looking for. You're really good here, you're really strong here, not so much here. Let's try and work on it and we'll see what happens. I think it might be helpful, like you said, to have some of those things available, not just weeks before, but months before, and have them available on the website at least, so that they're accessible.
I mean, we did, you know, when we were kids, that was something we understood. seems to be being shaped for sport.
You can play a lot of Xbox either.
That shouldn't be a shock, but, you know, people schedule vacations, the expectations for availability should be out there so that people can plan.
And it's also, I think it goes to consistency as well, we talked about it, it's written out there and it's available broadly, no one can say, well, gee, I didn't know that was a requirement, or I thought, you know, we talked about it, and it didn't seem like it was that important, and, you know, I think the more open you make that, the better off you are.
Pete, I didn't quite understand the point you were making to about doing things prior to a season, or requirements prior to a season. What was your point about that?
Well,
Did you have-
I can't tell you, if you're gonna play hockey, I can't tell you that if you miss every workout that's voluntary, I'm gonna hold that against you to make the team. And
No,
coach-
but the coach can, to Peter's point, say, you need to show up ready to, in a state of fitness.
That is correct.
And with your skills at a level that are appropriate for.
And there's a different way, and you're saying
play.
it the politically correct way. But if I say to you, you're not on the team because you missed 30 out of 35 workouts
Summer work.
from June to August,
Okay.
I've violated a New York Public Health Comprehensive.
So what Peter's suggesting is not outside of that.
That is correct.
No.
You can't say everybody, we're going to go to the Colgate team camp, everybody has to be there.
Yeah.
If you don't go to that camp, you aren't on the team.
Because that's a whole nother misnomer that's out there. Certain coaches are making certain things mandatory, and coaches are telling kids not to play this sport or that sport. I mean, I've had those meetings with those coaches that have been accused of that as well. So it's, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there's,
Yeah.
I don't think it happens a lot, but could we have something down where it says, just because you made varsity or JV in 10th grade or 11th grade doesn't give you, you know, a
see, I
guaranteed
like
spot
that,
in
I
the
like
next
that
year?
too. I like that. That's, and again, there's why they call tryouts. See, I've had to defend that as well because of that very reason. Well, my kid made it last year. Because if we just took every returning kid that made a team, there would be very few spots for, you know.
And there'd be fewer kids trying out.
Right?
But I think it makes an excellent point, because I have heard that too, that there are certain sports where you're encouraged, I'll put that in quotations, to only do that sport.
Right.
And when you're not in season for that sport, you should be doing developmental stuff for that sport, not
Right.
another sport. And somebody, I don't know.
Well, that comes down to right here, playing 3 sports for a specialization.
Yeah, that was one of the things we talked about.
Right.
And I think, I don't know if it was you, Jamie, or somebody else said to me that a lot of, for kids that are really gonna go on to do athletics in college, that, the prep school, is that what it's called? In between, look for kids that have done a multitude of sports, not just specialized in hockey or specialized in whatever sport. They look for kids that have done a number of sports, because it develops them in whatever sport it is that they go on to play. So I think that we need to make sure that that's being communicated, because again, that's the stuff that comes back to the board, you know. Well, I was told my son shouldn't play, you know, should only be doing this, and he was really discouraged from trying out to do this. But that's not appropriate, I mean, I think that, yes.
I think that's a matter of personal choice. I mean, as a parent, you have to kind of look at the landscape and say, I think my kid is only gonna be able to,
But
or I
that's a
think.
parent's choice as opposed to a
well,
coach's choice.
Yes, right,
That's
yeah,
what
so really, I don't think there's anything that we can tell coaches that's going to dictate how you as a parent are gonna arrive at that conclusion.
I'm not talking about the parents, I'm talking about, I've heard from parents that a coach said to a kid, why are you even trying out for that team? You shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing this for my sport.
Well, I guess that could happen. I'm not saying it's good advice, but, but I guess it could, and it probably has happened.
But I think that that's, personally, I don't think that that's appropriate. I think that if a kid wants to try, you know, badminton, tennis, and field hockey, that kid should be allowed to try all those sports, and that no coach should be saying to a kid, as long as that kid's in shape, as we just discussed, they should be allowed to play whatever it is they want to play. And if for some reason they don't make a team because of that choice, that's, I guess, okay, but to hear that a coach is actively discouraging a kid from participating in another sport that that
Oh, I
child is
agree,
interested
the
in,
coach
I
should
think
not
that's
do that,
inappropriate.
it's not, but where that falls into this effort, I'm not sure.
Okay, two other things that I just want to hit quickly. One is we spent a lot of time in regards to communication last meeting. And New Hartford does have a very specific communication protocol with their red card. And if you can take a look at it's page 26.
Oh, we do have that.
On page 26, second column, fourth down to the bottom, it says athletic concerns, and we talked about this, and here's New Hartford's specific protocol. If there's an athletic concern, you talk to the coach. Step two, you talk to Mr. Albanos. Third, you talk to the building principal. Fourth, it's the superintendent. So that's a very specific protocol that has been established and is in place. I wouldn't bring this.
And that's also on the New Hartford Athletic Code of Conduct, that the blue sheet. We also put that on there as well, just again, as so that the parents see that and know, if there are concerns, to start with the coach and then come to me and right on up the line there.
Next step. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just in regards to this, we mentioned it last week, that if I override steps 1, 2, and 3 and go with Mr. Noel, that this committee's recommending to he and everybody else that you ask, did you talk to the people in Orford? We said this last week. And that could be whether it's somebody knows or doesn't.
So you're suggesting that Mr. Knoll or the superintendent at whatever time not field any questions regarding athletic policy unless step 1, 2, and 3 have not.
Right. And the principal do the same.
Because we
And
want more information on the way up, then
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, look into this now. He's gotta go look into this and takes time away from his job.
yeah.
And it might be a simple answer.
And Mr.
Some
Smith.
problem may be solved way before that, if you
Right.
follow that chain.
Exactly.
Yes.
And Mr. Smith, if he comes to Mr. Alvanos said, speak with the coach first. I would love to say, did the child speak to the coach first to teach that self-ed is, but anyway, that's not there. Ladies and gentlemen, could we please turn to the coaching evaluation chart? This, I think, because of time, will be the last thing we touch on, and then we'll ask for anybody to speak. And then I'd like to set up the meetings for the rest of the, so we can have an idea of closure for our committee. Okay? So, this is the evaluation form that New Hartford uses to evaluate coaches. And I'd like to ask Mr. Alvanos to explain the procedure for evaluating coaches. And because one of the recommendations that this committee had said last week is that they would like to recommend to the Board of Education to where's my words to this? Let me make sure I have it right. The recommendation to strengthen the New Hartford coaches evaluation system. Okay?
Well, and again, I think you see there, it's broken down into 3, preseason, in-season, and postseason. Again, I think it's, I don't want to say self-explanatory, but all the things that we've talked about with regards to team meetings, expectations, criteria, parent meeting prior to first contest. And then, number 4 is usually for a varsity coach only, that he or she conduct preseason staff meetings with your assistants, with your JV coach, with your modified coach. And then in season, you know, a lot of those eligibility of all student athletes, that could be anything from making sure all your kids have updated physicals. Certainly in season, we need a list of accurate eligibility list for the bus garage with contact numbers. You know, God forbid there's an accident on a bus. We need to know who was on the bus, who signed out. Again, plans and prepares for practice and games, maintains positive rapport with student athletes. And then postseason, you know, did you collect all your uniforms and equipment? Did you do your end of the season reports? And then do you have postseason meetings, again, if you're the varsity coach, typically with your assistants and or JV modified coaches? And then comments or what the coach and I either talked about or what they've requested, if it's an equipment need, anything of that nature. And then that last coach's statement is anything that he or she would like to add, and then certainly I sign it, we mail it, and he or she signs it and gets it back. And then one stays, as you can see there, with the assistant superintendent, and one stays with the superintendent.
I have a question. How
Yes.
do you evaluate number 5?
Well, that, you know, again, I tried to very, you know, when I first got here, what I really wanted to do was, because this always happened in college, was they let your athletes do kind of an evaluation of you as a coach. And I thought, man, what a great tool. But again, because of our teachers union contract, you know, we don't have the math students evaluate the math teachers. So I do, you know, I'll try to just casually ask kids, you know what I mean, how's it going? Without saying, do you like your coach or not like your coach? You could, you know, if I'm at a contest or I'm at a practice, how they interact. And 9 out of 10 times, a coach will come and tell me he's got a problem with a certain student athlete because of that word attitude, bad attitude, you know what I mean? So there, when I get that heads up from a coach, then I'm probably more likely to go visit that practice just to see, is the kid standoffish or is that coach riding the kid to give him a bad attitude, things of that nature.
I've talked to several parents who their children, and it's not all coaches, so it's not a blanket thing at all, it's just, you know, occasionally we'll have a coach that is a negative reinforcer as opposed to a positive reinforcer. And some children do not respond to that, but they're afraid to say something because then they're not gonna make the team.
Right.
So that's, I'm just trying to figure out how do you really, and if a coach knows you're gonna come, I mean, even if they don't know, but they see you, they're obviously gonna be on their best behavior if you're there because they know you're evaluating.
Right. Well, again, I've tried to tell parents, and I know that that's the biggest concern is repercussion to my kid. You know, any parent that's ever called me, it's remained a confidential conversation. I mean, I take notes and I write the parent's name down, but when I meet with that coach, I don't say, you know, Mr. Smith
Right.
called and upset, or, you know, Mrs. Jones or anything of that nature. So, you know, that's comes with the territory, I guess you could say, with regards to the negative reinforcement. And there are times, if I see that, then certainly that'll be part of my discussion that I might have with that coach in terms of, and there have been times when I've seen it at a practice or a game that I've called the coach to say, Jake, I'm not sure that was appropriate for given the circumstance of what just took place. And I get the heat of the battle and the emotions and all those kind of things. We all have that, but there are certainly times and places for those things as well.
Your question is excellent. You know, how do we evaluate that? You know, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, the coach follows the rubric for selecting the team. Where would I see that here? You know, the coach, you know, told me I'll never play another game in my life because I'm not working hard to practice. That can go two ways. You know, I can go in the tank, or I can work my tail off. And, you know, and that's where your job is to see, well, did this work to motivate him? Because all of a sudden he thrives on this negative thing. The other athlete goes right in the tank and can't perform, is so nervous now. So that's what I think is important. But the specific things that, you know, you feel comfortable that this can handle some of these?
Well, again, I think that, you know, I haven't seen a model out there that's leading me to believe, you know, that there needs to be more or less. And again, I think that when you look at what the evaluation tools are, a lot of it is, if not all of it's in our coach's handbook. So it's kind of reinforcing what we've talked about in all of our coaches meetings with regards to what the district's expectations are for them to be coaches and.
Well, do we want this to be more specific? Understands and complies with the guidelines in the coach's handbook. That's very specific. We want conducted an effective and meaningful parent meeting. Complied with the injury policy and with the training staff. You know, those are real specific. Are those types of things doable, and will they strengthen the evaluation? And my biggest worry is, with all you administrators, how are they actually gonna ever get it done in a meaningful way?
Pete, how many teams do we have?
63.
How many
I think you've got 100 coaches.
93. Okay, is there a timeline for you at the end of the fall season that you have to get those fall coaches done?
There's only a timeline that I put on myself. I mean, there's, no one says that the fall evaluations have to be done by December 1. But I try to, I'm constantly meeting with coaches, taking notes. And then I'll meet with the next coach, and then I'll take one day where I just type up those evaluations. But there's no, it doesn't say it's gotta be done by a certain date in the fall and in the winter and in the spring.
Whether they're recommended for reemployment or not, it doesn't matter.
Well,
Like if you're in the same
I've yet to
team
not
now.
recommend someone for reemployment, so to answer your question, unless it's something outlandish, I mean, every coach gets recommended for reemployment.
Okay.
I mean, the only time that that position will be posted is if a coach
They-
says
they stop.
I'm leaving because I'm whatever.
See, I'm just thinking, I hate to do this to you or anybody in position, but I think there's gotta be some timeline where all these should be done. And then you mentioned December 1st, I was using that as just a date, because I think you are too. If, you know, between your emails, text messages, letters, whatever go out to people, there's gotta be a line of communication there that says, Danielle, we wanna meet with you, put you off, or Danielle, we gotta meet with you, at times she puts you off. Now you have a paper trail there of trying to reach her to get the thing done. Cause I foresee sometimes, maybe you're chasing people, and yet with all your other commitments of going to games, contests, and now you're gonna be evaluating the winter people, things back up. Would it behoove your office to have a timeline? I'm just throwing it out.
I think it's, I mean, again, I think it certainly is possible to have a timeline. But again, my schedule changes too with contests and practices and preseason coaching. You know, I mean, there's a lot of times you're trying to put one season to bed and get another one started, so there's overlap all the time, with regards to.
I would just hate to see some coach or coaches, for whatever reason, your schedule, their schedule, it gets dragged out, then, you know, even though you made notes, sometimes you lose things rather than.
If it's that pressing, I'll go meet that coach in their office. I mean, I think I know where he's going. If there was an issue that big, then I'll go, if I gotta go to junior high or wherever I need to go to. I'm just saying, most of the times, there hasn't been anything that pressing that's warranted. Drop everything and go meet with that coach.
All right, my other question on this is that the 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. And I think all of us know what's going on with teacher evaluations. Keith, you might be able to help me out if I get stuck. With the Regents reform and APPR. And for teachers and administrators now, the 4s are now 3s. Right or wrong? That could be the new standard.
Well, as in our district,
As
in
a-
the Hartford district. What was a 4 is now really a 3.
Do you see that happening? Has it been happening? Is anybody like, for evaluations now, you're gonna be told, maybe saying somebody, you know, you're a 3, and I'm gonna say, Pete, I've been a 4 my whole life, now I'm a 3, anything like that?
No, I mean, if you've been a 4 and you get your uniforms and equipment handed in like you've always done, then you're still gonna be a 4 in that area. But if last year you got your equipment handed in November 1st and now it's January 1st and it's still not there, then I'm gonna give you a 3. And that's one of the other reasons why you talk about a timeline. Some coaches like to collect varsity, JV, and modified uniforms and hand them in all in one so that they know they're all there. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's where that flexibility, if you will, making it a hard and fast timeline. Football, sometimes we let them use equipment to go to camps. So that, that's equipment that's been in, but now it's out. So, you know what I mean? It's, again, each sport, I think, is different with regards to that. But, the only time a coach would go from a 4 to a 3 is if, they didn't conduct a team meet. You know what I mean? If they didn't do the things that they've always been doing.
They had a number of these 12 things drop down.
Correct.
Or won't.
Correct.
Okay.
My observation is that almost all of the items that they're evaluated on are basically administrative. There seems to be a very minimal amount of evaluation of their ability to teach a specific skill or to improve the body of knowledge of the players about the sport they're teaching. I mean, the only thing that says is plans and prepares for practices or games, but it doesn't say, do they use practice time effectively? Do they teach specific skills? Are they to their sport? Are they improving the player's knowledge? And the other part that also sort of bothers me is that there's no means of evaluation for the constituents. Parents, players. There's no solicitation of input from those people who the coaches are, whose interests they're supposed to be serving, which might be a little bit more critical of coaches who are not necessarily teaching the skills. And unfortunately, because of the prediction of club sports, there's a lot of coaches out there who are watching their kids be coached by somebody else, and so we all think we know it all. But I just think that there's a big lack here of real evaluation of a coach's performance, other than does he get the uniforms in on time.
Well, again, I think I shared that with you in the beginning, is I wanted to do that, but that goes against the teacher's union contract, because you're not allowed to evaluate the math teacher, nor is your child. You might have voice your concerns, but I'm just saying that I think because the coaches fall under the teacher's union contract, that was one of the things and reasons I was given not to hand that out. Again, because I thought, I always learned from that. When kids would evaluate me as a coach, I thought that was one of the best tools that I could use, but it was one of those ones that we don't do it in any other academic setting. Why would we allow it in this?
Well, I'm not saying the other part's right.
And I agree with you too. So again, I'm not,
I would agree that there should be some.
I'm just
some
letting you know what would
criteria.
Just, I think to Jamie's point, I was going to make almost the identical observation, except
Sure.
that almost, except that when I look at on our page 3, the successful coaches possess the following 4 traits, and then we have a whole other list of the coaches' code of behavior and ethics. Very few of those items seem to trickle up to the evaluation, and to me that feels like we're saying these are the things we want you to be, but we're not going to evaluate you on that. We're going to evaluate you on, as Jamie pointed out, sort of administrative things. And that to me, I don't think it's fair to the coaches, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to Pete either. The other thing that I would say is we've talked about, the consistency within each sport. So if you have a sport where there's a varsity, a JV, and a modified coach, how much, and I don't know the answer to this question, how much does, say, in order to make this evaluation of the varsity coach more robust, is it possible to take some of evaluations off of your, at least this in-depth evaluation off your plate by having the varsity coaches perform some kind of preliminary evaluation of their coaches beneath them, the JV and the modified coach? And would that also lend itself to having a consistent philosophy within each individual sport, so that the varsity soccer coach, can communicate their general philosophy, which is now being directly evaluated by compete to make sure that it's consistent with that of the school district, and then making sure that that's trickling down to both the JV and the modified level. And would that help you, Pete? Because as Paul pointed out, you're evaluating 100-something coaches. We're asking for it to be more robust, but it's not fair for us to say, okay, you need to do more in the same period of time for the same number of coaches. Can we make the evaluation more robust by incorporating some of these things, the core traits, some of the intangibles that Jamie's talking about, and on the other side of that, charge the varsity coaches with doing some evaluation of the coaching staff in the uniform?
Well, I think that the varsity coach already does that, you know, and, well, again, because when I usually try to meet with them first. And again, I think it goes back to, you know, if there's a problem, the first thing I ask the varsity coach is, you know, did you have your preseason, did you clearly define your expectation to your staff in the preseason meeting? Well, when that varsity coach says I didn't have a preseason meeting, it makes it tough for me to defend that varsity coach to say, geez, let's make a change here, here, or there, because how do they know? You know what I mean? It's almost like if I didn't go through this manual 3 times a year and I called you in and said, well, geez, you know, you didn't go over the criteria or the expectations of the people, I don't know what they are. You know what I'm saying? So I think the varsity coaches kind of already do that. You know, could we make it a little more expensive? We probably could, but, I mean, at what point do you want to?
For it to be meaningful though, and I don't know if the board would ever consider this, because you're making an excellent recommendation to make it more robust. That needs a lot more time for him, but would the board be willing to say, okay, in the fall, the extensive evaluations are going to be of the field hockey program and of the swimming program. Just like I think what you do in regards to curriculum, this year it's math and English, next year it's technology and is that, you know what I mean? So then you could do a little more in-depth evaluation, but all I can think of is you.
Well,
And what you're going through this year. And we're gonna do this with him as well?
what we're going through is difficult, but our district is at the forefront, and I speak from a
Well, I
lot
know
of
that.
teachers in another district. I have a sister-in-law who's an administrator in another district. I talk to colleagues at BOCES, and through the efforts of Mr. Conjo from the curriculum side, our APPR is so much more than this, but I probably, I think this is a lot more work for Mr. Albanus. Like, I'm thinking of 2 of the domains under the teacher, learning environment and attention to individuals. When I think of those 2 things and the bullets that go along with those, I wish I would have thought about this, I would have brought a copy. A lot of that addresses exactly what we should be doing versus a lot of the terminology here. There is an alignment, academics and athletics, there is. Through my experience of looking at this tonight and reviewing it.
You're educating children.
Yes, and those two domains specifically are very specific, whether it's a classroom or a field, a learning environment, and we are paying attention to individuals. So that would be my only suggestion, that if we continue down the road, we might want to look at that. Because this is a lot of work.
Well, I think unfortunately, we've just started to scratch the surface with this. I'd like to conclude this now for the time being and continue this at our next meeting. And I'd like to now open it up for anybody that has been very gracious in attending these meetings. You have an opportunity now to express yourself, and you understand the guidelines that I established at the beginning, and any questions there. And seeing that a lot of you are friends of mine, I trust you anyway.
Ed Flema, guys, thanks for.
Is this a campaign?
No.
No, I'm teasing.
No, thanks, man. Safety, the reduction of injury in sport, the concussions that Tim is working so hard to manage now in the process of concussions. But what are we doing to reduce the injuries, the serious injuries, the ones that cause a kid to be out for a game? Something to look at if we're going to be on the proactive side of things. Anyway, there's ways to do that. So just something to consider in your discussions. Secondly, there's an answer to the question about cutting kids and what do you do? How do you recommend them go somewhere else? It's up there at that weight room. We had 300 kids through a strength and conditioning program. Even Mr. Bovee, you know, was telling a kid that was on his wrestling team, look, man, you know, you're not gonna make it, you know, I mean, so, and he brought him over to the conditioning room and said, Ed, hey, help me with this kid, you know, get him in here, get him in shape, you know, work with him, you know, and then maybe next year you can do that. So the answer's there. We've done it. You know, Keith was there, Pete knows about it, you know, Tim and all these guys. So consider that as an extracurricular activity. That's something that I wanted the board to look at last year, but never got a chance to get it in front of the board. So something to look at. It also helps with the reduction of injuries. Through that program, we showed that we could reduce serious injury, at least on the football field, by 300% if they would work out and get in shape through the program. So that's my comment so far.
Well, some schools have incorporated weightlifting as an intramural program, where you have paid physicians as intramural, and that was, some schools that's a very popular.
Yeah, it was like I said, it was, you know, we had girls, we had boys, 7 through 12.
It's not just football.
It's not just football, it was everybody. We had handicapped kids, we had kids with Down syndrome in there. It was, like I said, we had 300 kids through it in 2 years, and at one time, I was working out 100 kids at one session.
Okay, so your recommendation is that this committee looks at.
Something like that. I think it's an answer to some of the things you guys were discussing, you know?
And I think New Hartford is so lucky to have the types of professionals that you have, but you have to do even more now with some of the recommendations, or regulations, let's say that. So, your recommendation I have here is address injury reduction program.
Yep, that and then an extracurricular activity where you don't have to schedule fields. It's a strength and speed conditioning program that you can have right up there at the weight room and say, hey, you know, look, man, you know, you're not gonna make the team, but look, get up there with Coach Rahill and spend a year with him. It addresses Pete's issue of, hey, now the kid's dragging the parents to take them to the junior high to condition themselves, you know, and work on these things, and maybe next year you make the team, you know?
Thank you. Yep.
Two quick points. Paul, you kind of made this up, and it looks like you did a nice job on it. And we talked about that winning is secondary to player development. I want to just talk quickly about the modified sports. I think it's the school districts. I think they need to include as many kids as they can at that modified level. I couldn't disagree with you more. I don't think you can label these kids coming in the 7th grade and 8th grade as these are the players, these are not the players. The kids that are players at that level now are the kids that have played club sports up to that point. They've been given opportunities through parents and organizations, and quite frankly, the kids at that level are going to get their fill of basketball and soccer because they're going to play at the club level. They're not going to depend on the modified season where they're playing 2 quarters a game or a quarter a game to get that experience. But there's so many kids out there that I think need to include. I think they want to be part of a team. I think it helps them. It gets them off their couch. It gets them off hanging out. They may never been a part of a team. And I think we have to be unique to each sport. I know, Pete, you touched on it, like the baseball team this year. There's a lot of nice players. A lot of kids were cut, and a lot of kids didn't try out because they thought they were going to get cut, but you can't blame them. Well, let's say, all right, I got a lot of numbers in baseball. You take those 16 through 19 kids who now are playing 2 innings and getting 1 at bat. You have a second team. Now those 16 through 19 kids are getting a lot more time, and you got 10 more kids that you're not dropping from your program. And I'll guarantee you that the 15 kids are not going to be the same kids on varsity. It just, I know we were looking at yearbooks a while back, and we had 18 kids on our 7th grade basketball team. And I'm sure I wouldn't have made it if we'd have kept 12. And I played for you. I started for you as a senior. But I wouldn't have made the team. Maybe I would have quit basketball. Who knows what I would have done. But we kept 18 kids. And I think we need to include as many kids as we can at that modified level. You know, and you got to do it season by season. Soccer, if you got enough, you do it. Baseball, if you got enough, you do it. Basketball, if you got enough, you do it. Some sports you can't. But I think if we don't give kids the opportunity to pursue what they want to do, I don't think we're really serving the children as we're supposed to do. And the best point, and you're right, I was at a modified sporting event, and there was a player on the modified team that made a fantastic play, and the varsity coach of that sport was in attendance at the game, and everybody was kind of gravitating to him. You know, a varsity guy shows up, and his comment to the crowd was, "What is that boy doing playing this other sport? He should be playing this sport 12 months out of the year." So that message is definitely, you know, amongst the coaches. I was there, I heard it, and I've heard other instances, but that's just, it's out there. It's not, people aren't just telling you, you know, it exists, so you know, Pete. That's the message that's going around. And, go ahead.
For those of us that don't know you, who?
I'm Rick Falvo. I've had kids, I've got 3 kids, and we played probably, I want to say 7 different sports, boys and girls. And I can say that each sport they've played has been run completely different. Not a lot of consistency. Some I rave about, some I think were run very poorly. And it's usually a reflection of the coach. And not that the coach isn't trying, it's just sometimes it's the effort, sometimes how they get along with the kids. But there's not a lot of consistency in guidelines that are being followed. 7 different sports at different levels, modified, varsity, you know, and I can tell you that it's usually a time commitment on the coaches, you know, effort, and they talk with the parents, and they inform the parents, and some don't. So, and the kids know it. The kids know which ones do and which ones don't, and so do the parents. But I think we need to be consistent. I think that's what parents want. Some consistency from the top down. That's really what we're looking for as parents.
And one other thought I wanted to mention, I'm Karen Madden, if you don't know me. The playing time at the 3 different levels call that you put together, I think that's good, but one of the things that I was looking for that I still feel like we got was a mission statement for each of the levels. Like, that's an important component of what we want to get out of each of the levels, modified, varsity, JV. But I still don't really see a mission statement. And I think with a clear and simple mission statement by level, that's what you use to create your evaluation form. And along with the characteristics, like what Beth was saying, the characteristics of what we're looking for in a coach. So I'm really focused, I think I've talked to a bunch of you folks on the committee at different points, and that's what I'm really focused on, is trying to see if we can get that's out there and broad enough so that, you know, you don't tie people's hands by it, but specific enough so that there's some good understanding of what we're trying to do at each level, and it is different. I understand that it is different at each level. And I just think that if we do that, a lot of these inconsistencies that we hear about and we experience as parents with kids on these teams can be addressed.
Can you, because we talked about this, and I feel like we're moving towards that, so can you give me, for all of us, kind of a sense of what that looks like to you? I mean, it doesn't have to be like, you know,
I don't
you rewrote it last
have
night,
the
but-
words, but I think a mission statement, usually when you think like of a corporate mission statement, it's 2 or 3 sentences. It's very, you know, at the modified level, our goal is to include as many kids as possible and work to teach skills and develop character. I don't know, that's obviously just pulled out of the air. At the junior varsity level, it's more with a focus of developing kids to have the talent to move on toward varsity. You know, I don't know how that's
similar
different.
to what Mr. Pietrowski said earlier in regards to the playing time.
With the playing time,
Are
yeah.
you familiar with the page 3 of the coach's handbook on unifying ideas and perspectives?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, well, let me show it to you, because I think this is, and then the sports participation philosophy, as I think this is the direction now. When I said mission statement, put in the components of the 3 levels that Mr. Pietrowski said, and I said, put those outcomes in the mission statement. I was redirected to this, which makes much more sense than the direction I was going in, to put it into the unifying ideas and perspectives, and then you had another page that I don't see it right offhand. But I think Mrs. Madden, that's the direction I think we're going in now, So the mission statement is the New York State Public High School Athletic Association mission statement. That's the mission statement of section 3. It's the mission statement of New Hartford Athletics. But
And
we're
is
being
this-
more
is this the
specific.
mission statement? No, where is the mission statement?
It
The
is,
mission statement.
Got it. Is it in this handout?
We're gonna really slowly though.
Oh, where did we get this?
That's the New York State one.
That's also on.
yeah, that's the New Hartford and the New York State mission statement.
Oh, I've not seen this. Where is this? though?
This is in the coaches'
Oh, in
handbook.
the coach's handbook, okay.
Yeah. And one of the recommendations that I think, I hope I'm not making this up, is that that type of thing be put in the newsletter and on the website, but, you know, so those are constantly cycled each season.
But I hear what she's saying, and I feel like if you look at, do you have this, Karen, in front of you?
Yeah.
This document, that Paul prepared, the
Oh,
draft with the
yes.
attachment, if you look, at the second page, number 1, I feel like that's describing to some extent what you're saying, there's like 12 points here. And then I do feel like what Paul prepared, so for junior varsity, for example, if you take the first sentence, the purpose of junior varsity is to further develop players for the varsity team. Every effort will be made to ensure all players are participating in regularly scheduled contests. So I guess, to me, that is sort of a mission statement. We're saying that winning is secondary to player development. The purpose is to further develop the players for the varsity team, and that will ensure that all the players participate as often as they can. And then, so to me, those, with the exception of the modified,
Yeah,
which
the
we take
modified
number
doesn't
1.
make it, yeah.
Well, yeah, and that number 1 is close, and I hear what you're saying about the inclusiveness, and I don't think we necessarily covered that aspect of it. We talked a lot about it. But I do feel like what Paul prepared sort of does provide what you're describing, and I guess that's why I'm asking, like, what do you feel like is missing from that, that we could further develop?
I guess I focused a little bit on the modified and just, and I really, like Rick does, I feel strongly about trying to include as many kids as possible.
In the sport that they're interested in, so for
Yeah.
you, not, putting them on cross-country or track is not satisfactory.
Well,
And I'm not, it's not like a judgment, I'm just
I don't
asking.
know, I mean,
for clarification.
just, and making the kids have a sense of value. I mean, I think I've had this discussion with some of you, it's like, there's a way to make that 12th kid on the basketball team feel valued, even though they're not getting a lot of playing time on the court. It's like, God, we really need you in practice, you're making our team get better, and we feel valued having you. We wanna value your participation. I think to include and value as many kids as possible, understanding that there's a different level of ability, that's okay, and not saying to the kids, okay, you're gonna get the same amount of playing time as the best person. I'm not trying to say that at all, but I think that we need to value, kids' participation in these sports and give them a place to be. I wanna give these kids a place to be that's not on the couch playing Xbox with somebody in Nebraska.
Well, there's a thing to sport that's interesting, because my kids do these projects, which it never worked for me either, but it's a group project. And invariably, it's like, even now we do group projects with different schools, which we didn't do when I was a kid, but we do group projects, and invariably there's a kid who does nothing. And you're like, my grade's gonna be terrible, so, you know, I've had one child just say, I told that kid, keep your stuff, I'll write your portion of the project, because I can't have the grade tank over your lack of effort or understanding. I mean, the kid was not that direct, but sport teaches you different. You can't do that in sport. I can't be the center and the guard and the quarterback and the halfback. And if those guys don't do their job, we're gonna lose. And you learn that, or if I don't do my job, I can't take the approach, I'm gonna let those guys carry my load, and then I'll get a good grade. I'll get a victory. And you can't, I guess my point is there's certain lessons you cannot teach in the classroom. You can only teach, but can best teach on the athletic field. And yeah, when we get to varsity, we can't have everybody out there, but encouraging as many people as we can encourage to have that experience is a good part of our, I think of that as a good expenditure of a educational tax dollar. Because in their professions, unless they are so low at what they do, they will have to combine and cooperate and coordinate if they want to have successful enterprise. And that's, theoretically, that is the lesson of team sport. I think you can learn that in the band as well. You know, if the trumpets are great, everybody else is terrible, the band sounds bad. But when everybody plays well, the band sounds great. And that teaches.
Trumpets are always great. We're both trumpets.
Dick, can I make a suggestion?
Yes, please.
Because Karen, I believe you're just seeing page 3, 4, and 5 in my draft.
Yeah.
Okay, could we ask her to go home, digest it, and then come back? Because you're asking if there's anything missing. I just don't know if we're giving her ample
I
opportunity
like that idea.
to sit there and do it, so
Yeah, no, I
if she
agree.
goes back.
You
The
can
other
keep
thing,
it
the other thing I wanted to say was that, agreeing with Pete, there's band, there's sports, there's other things. And I don't think it should be the expectation of the school district to get every kid off the couch. At some point, the parents gotta say, get off the couch. You don't like band, you didn't make sports, you didn't make band, you're not doing this, you're not in clubs, get off the couch.
Go mow the lawn.
Yeah, but if he tries out, he wants to get off the couch. If he tries out, he's saying, I'm gonna commit
I
two
know, but-
hours out of the day, and you're telling me that I can't.
But-
Right? He's showing
Okay,
ambition.
what do you do with the child who doesn't like sports, doesn't like band, doesn't like anything?
Yeah, but if the kid doesn't like sports, oh, he's not gonna try out for a team, he's not gonna commit
So,
to
that's
showing
what I'm
up 2
saying,
hours a
you
day
can't
at
go off the
practice.
couch. And I don't think it's up to us, I'm gonna say the board at this point, to provide two teams or whatever it is, so we're gonna provide every kid, the marginal or whatever, opportunity to go play, and then play for 2 hours a day, and he or she are out there, and then reality's gonna hit in next year, you're gone.
Yeah,
Now,
see, I think I disagree, I think we just disagree with him. Any kid that wants to play trombone, you know, he can play. You don't tell him he can't play, he can play, he's got an interest
So
in
I'm saying
trombone.
after the first year, I said after the first year, if he's playing modified, or she's playing modified, and then the next year, they're not good enough to make the JV team, then it sets it, then everybody can tell them then to do.
No, it's 7th and 8th grade, you can't tell me that you know who all the players are, it's not possible. It's just not possible.
I'm saying there's gonna be a cutoff,
Yeah.
it's not how many kids are gonna
Yeah.
go.
I think what we have, the biggest challenge is finding the balance between the funding, the safety, the providing opportunities. That's what you have to do, is find that balance. Timmy?
I'm Tim Madden, for those of you that don't know me, I have 3 kids in the district, and I also run the youth basketball program for boys and girls, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, which is our intramural program. I also coached the travel team for the 4th grade boys this year for my first time. And first of all, we all understand and appreciate it's getting harder and harder for everybody, not just teachers and coaches, but in youth sports. It's just too many people are too involved, and it's frustrating. And for me personally, at 4th grade, I had a couple teams. We had a pretty competitive team, and I faced a team from Frankfurt and a team from United that came with 6 kids. This is 4th grade. That's all they bring. Parents got his own kid, and he only wants 5 other kids. And you have that battle all the time. We try to encourage we had 12 uniforms for each of our travel teams, take at least 10 and 2 alternates, ideally. Because to Rick's point, and to Paul's point to a certain degree, at 4th grade, everybody that shows up, we're gonna say, we're not gonna develop you, because most of them aren't that good, because they're just starting. So it's very frustrating. And if I'm a varsity coach, I want the guy that's gonna have 2 teams or 12 or 15 kids, not the guy that wants 6 in 4th grade and start from there coming up. But we always don't have that luxury. So it's nice to know what is our new Hartford policy, so in our youth programs we can kind of at least have an idea. Naturally, we always want to promote as many kids as we can. And we run into the same thing. How many uniforms do you have? How many gyms do you have? And whatnot. One year, with Rick coach in 5th grade, we did go with 2 teams. We had 25 kids come out, and a lot of them could play. But it creates, and I don't think there's a right and wrong. I think there's 2 philosophies. And as far as consistency, I think that's the daunting task for you folks and for our school district to come up with, because going back to last week with Dan Pope's comments as far as playing time, he doesn't address parents' concerns of playing time. And Paul disagreed, thinking you have to talk to parents. As a parent, I'm sitting back going, I kind of agree more with Paul, but I could live with Dan's. If it's gonna be New Hartford's philosophy to say we're going with that, okay, as long as we all know and it's consistent. But I think the biggest problem now that we have from the perception in the community from parents is it's anything but consistent in many different levels. And going back to Jamie's point, which I thought was great, was at some point, how do you people, be it the teachers, the athletic director, the board, come to understand what are the concerns? And we know they're not all valid, especially from us parents. They're not always valid. But we have to at least address them so that we can try to identify some of these concerns and try to be consistent. So at least people, maybe you don't like the way it is, but people can maybe accept it as long as, well, that's the way they do it. They did it with, when he went up, and he went up, and I went up, and that's the way it is. And then it is a choice to participate in the sports. So, and that's a tough part, but I would hope the committee would give some thought to, do we even know what the concerns are or the problems? And again, you started off this committee and talked about, what do we want integrity in a coach and all that stuff, which is wonderful. But one other quick example, and I'll be done, is 2 years ago in a 7th grade basketball game against a certain team that was weak, our team beat them 68-8. And I've never been more embarrassed to be from New Hartford. It was in their gym, and the looks from these parents. And the problem that we had is a modified level, is you had A play the first and third quarter, and B play the second and the fourth, and fifth you play whatever you want. For whatever reason, the A played in the first and the third, and obviously the competition was, it was a weak school, but that wasn't the problem, the concerns of the parents who were playing a weak school. Nobody can do anything about that. The concern is you had a coach.
Scheduling.
Right, the schedule's the schedule, that's not a problem, but you adjust to it. That's where you come back to your code of conduct and all that other stuff. And that coach played the starters in the 1 and the 3, which surprised me, but she brought the starters back for the 5th quarter. And that to me was egregious. So it's those type of things that will get people riled up, that has to be addressed. And that's just one example.
I just had a question. I'm Kim Schweitzer. I had a question for Pete. Last year on boys modified lacrosse, they didn't make any cuts. They had 40 kids go out, and they had 40 kids. They dressed 30 kids, and 10 kids were on the team, but they could earn their spot onto that, get a jersey, so to speak. And that didn't happen this year. I was just curious as to, I mean, I think that was a coach's decision from what we were told as parents. And I know there was talk, especially amongst those 10 kids that didn't get the jersey, how difficult that was. I don't know, I was just curious as to, and I know his practices were very difficult and all of that. There was an example where they let everyone play, but it did create a lot of issues. There weren't, you had 2 coaches for 40 kids, and practices were crazy, but I
think there's where, again, it's, the coaches try to do the right thing by keeping so many kids.
Right.
But there's the 10 that the coaches were getting beat up on because, geez, you kept my kid, now he can't play, he can't get a jersey. So, again, I think there's where you try that experiment as a coach, and you realize, geez, it backfired because the 10 that I thought I was doing a favor for, those are the ones that I got accused of not playing their child and so on and so forth, but they made the team.
Right.
And again, I think there's where it's the catch-22 is, yes, you try to keep the participation, but now trying to reward all those kids with playing time comes back to you try to make your cutoff, whatever that number is, talent-wise, and then below that. So I think that's why they opted to do what they did this year.
That was my biggest concern, there's a distance between what philosophically we'd like to do and A, what that philosophy looks like in practice, and B, logistically, what can we actually do? Because, we use the soccer as an example. You made an excellent point. We could say, we want to keep as many kids as we can. We'll have 3 soccer teams with that many kids try out, because let's face it, there's so many club teams, there's so many kids playing soccer. But what if we can't field them? What if we have nowhere to put them? What if we have nowhere to actually physically practice them? My brain just works in the practical, like how can that what does that look like in practice? And I guess that's why I was saying, and again, I'm trying to process what everybody is saying. Is it not enough to say to a kid who doesn't make a soccer team, you know what, you didn't make a soccer team, we still want you in a sport, you're still valuable to our athletic program, whether it's on soccer or not on soccer, and I'm just using soccer because we've been talking about. But you know what, try cross country, try indoor track, try whatever. Is that enough? Because it's possible that logistically speaking, particularly outdoor sports are one thing, the indoor sports, and we only have so many square feet of gym. You know, how can we schedule it the way that we're proposing? Even if philosophically we could all come to agreement and say, yep, you're right, we want to keep as many kids as we can on modified. If 100 kids try out, we will keep 100 kids because we believe that. And I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. I never want a kid to feel like, oh man, I love basketball or whatever it is, and I can't play. But
I didn't say never, I said at the modified
well,
level.
no, I'm saying at the modified level. And I guess that's what, you know, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not sure that even if we all agreed, could we actually execute it?
And maybe you're right, Beth, but the thing is I still want it to be something that we think through so that we're not having a situation where we cut 1 or 2 kids. And it does happen, because it's happened personally to my family, so it does happen. And, you know, and in that instance, my child was not told they should leave, even though you didn't make soccer, you should go try cross country.
She was phenomenal in cross country.
And
Not the first year, second.
She was never told, she was never given that. So that stuff does happen. And maybe we can't get to a point where we have 2 teams, but I think we need to, as coaches, the coaches need to give thought to how can I include as many people as possible and still make my practice, my team work.
And I hear like, how can we recruit enough coaches? How can we keep these kids organized? I mean, like, my daughter plays softball on a small team, and when her team is on the field, they're like little maniacs on the bench. I mean, even the parents are, cut that out, sit down. I mean, so when you were describing when you have, 40 kids at I'm sorry, Kim, you were describing, I'm sure they're kids, they're crazy.
I counted 78 track athletes in the gym this spring, 2 coaches.
What level?
At the varsity. No chance. Those coaches, I don't care how good they are, there's no chance they can teach and keep track of all this.
And 17 events.
Correct.
And if you can't, if you're gonna say, and believe me, I think sometimes the perception is that everybody wants all this stuff. It's the consistent thing. If you cut 1 kid, I'm okay with that. As long as everyone knows you're gonna cut 1 kid, the kids will adapt. They survive. They figure out, go do something else. That's okay. It really is. Sometimes that's the life lesson we're talking about. But, and it is a daunting task to organize all this, and to say in every sport we're going to do this, 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 and this. That, believe me, that is it. But, and I applaud the effort. I think that this is wonderful that there's talk and people are trying to put in and trying to organize to say, this is what we're at New Hartford. This is what we're going to do with the youth basketball program. I'd like to mar a little bit of what we do with those teams based on, well, at New Hartford, this is what they do. It just helps. And then when you can tell people, this is what we do, you want to be a part of it or you don't. And as long as that's the way it is. So it doesn't have to be, I just get nervous that people think the perception is we want everybody to play. Not really, because there is limits for everything.
And there's the value to paying your dues.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Okay. What I'd like to do right now is I want you to feel comfortable with where we're heading now in regards to the evaluation. So, without asking you beforehand, can you take a look and make some recommendations in regards to make it a little more robust? Okay. If there are maybe, start with at least 3 or 4 areas to have the evaluation tool reflect some of the things that we've talked about. And then the goal would be to make that recommendation to the Board of Education but you're the person that has to do it, you're the expert, you've gotta feel comfortable with it. The second part of the meeting, I think that's gonna take quite a while, and I think I've criticized myself as we're trying to do a little too much now. So I'd like to refocus with that, and the second part of the meeting, I'm going to ask Mrs. Madden to look at those components and see if we have successfully addressed some of your concerns as well. And I'd like to do that at the June 24th meeting, and just stop at June 24th unless you are dying to go all next year. Okay, but I'd like to have select one more meeting after June 24th to make, that's the day we make our, finalize our recommendations to the board, because we could keep going here. And then, but I also would like to tell the Board of Education, there are a number of other topics that people want to discuss. And do we do it through the athletic department? You know, what direction are we going to go with? Because it's very apparent that there are a number of things that people want to speak about, and concerns that they want to bring up.
5 p.m., June 24th.
5 p.m. June 24th, and
There's no awards ceremony?
I'm looking right now, in my book, no, but,
Isn't school done?
no, school's pretty much done, graduation is,
But I was wondering, like, there's no
Graduation's
senior
probably the
recognition?
23rd.
yeah, graduation is
Oh, all right.
Saturday.
okay.
Yeah.
I have some calendars if people like calendar in front of them, something like a hard copy. Yeah, they're electronic. Okay.
Okay. My lost my other.
Would July 8th be?
No, I think the 24th.
Well, July 24th, we do evaluation, and then we make a recommendation to the board. July 8th, or is that crazy to even think of it? The board? Yeah, you're meeting toward the end, I believe. I'm not, I think you are. Okay. Okay?
So another meeting on the 8th here?
Yeah, we'll plan on July 8th to wrap it up and make our recommendations. Okay. Mrs. Madden, you feel comfortable with that?
Yeah.
You sure? 5 o'clock, the 24th, and then we'll wrap things up on but the other thing is we'll make recommendations to the board as to what some other topics people want brought up, okay? So I think we could, go on. Okay, we good here?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You can have it all with me.
What's the subject?
Yeah.
There you go.
No, that's too bad. No. Yeah, take your time. He's got a new one. I got a new one. That's what I got. Yeah, hey, tomorrow is 7.
Okay, Karen.
The high school one. Wasn't there a new one that all supplementary? This is the old one? I will.
Or call.
This is
Has anybody got any council follows the newer draft?
I'm trying to find one that's not.
This is
Do you
the
have
old
another
one
copy
right
of the
there.
draft by?
But he's got the new
Paul's draft?
All right.
I'll see you.
This is
Oh, I know.
This one here.
So we'll see you Friday, Saturday? I'm keeping the
No,
place.
okay.
All right.
I will.
Let me just,
This is.
That's it.
This is that.
Yes, that's it.
that's a clean copy.
I don't know, I think it's great fear that you make them run out and say,
Yeah.
and you can't run any buildings, and try to make them hear you going.
I want the one that's written up there, that's the only problem. Is this an extra copy?
Yeah.
or-
Yeah, you can buy that.
You know, so,
Thank you.
You're
Good night.
Good night.